Hello, fellow Sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're lying still under low lamplight, walking alone beneath a star-heavy sky, or filling the hush of early morning with thought, this space is for you, because tonight we journey into the icy breath of deep time to rediscover everything we know about the Upper Paleolithic Ice Age world. This is calm storytelling for the curious and the tired, a forgotten world, shaped by 20,000-year-old winds, carved by silence, and kept alive in fragments of firelight and bone. But this is not a tale of cold and extinction. It begins not with a glacier, but with a mind. Oh, and if you're someone who finds beauty in the long arc of history, or you just like letting your thoughts drift through science and myth, take a second. Just below this video, there's a button marked subscribe. You can press it now and unsubscribe anytime. There's a bell beside it too if you'd like to be gently reminded when the next story arrives. That one tap helps more than you know. This channel depends on it to survive. Without your support, these stories simply can't be made. I wonder, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment. A quiet reminder that we're all still here, listening together. And if you fall asleep along the way, that's okay. You'll find chapters and timestamps below. Now, let's begin, with a world buried in ice and a spark of memory. To understand the Upper Paleolithic Ice Age world, you must first surrender to silence. Not the silence of absence, but of compression, of snow pressed into memory, of winds that do not howl but whisper through valleys carved by time. This was a world gripped by the Last Glacial Maximum, a span of several millennia when ice claimed dominion over continents and the bones of Earth were laid bare. Between 26 and 19,000 years ago, glaciers spilled like slow avalanches across the northern half of the world. Ice sheets taller than mountains smothered Scandinavia, reached down to the heart of modern-day Germany, and pulled the horizon inward. The air was dry, the forests had fled, the sea had retreated more than 100 meters from the present-day shore. Across Eurasia, the Mammoth steppe stretched unbroken, from the coasts of Iberia to the distant shadows of Beringia, and through it all, humans endured. What happens to thought in a world like this? What happens when the seasons fracture and the stars return sooner each night? This is not the story of a single cold moment. It is the story of generations born beneath a sky that never fully thawed. Imagine it. A breath exhaled into air so frigid that it turns to crystals mid-sentence. A baby swaddled in reindeer hide, opening its eyes for the first time to a world already in retreat. The sun, a rare visitor. Firelight, the only certainty. The Last Glacial Maximum was not a singular event, but a prolonged state of being, a locked posture in Earth's long breathing. It shaped everything, the placement of rivers, the migration of beasts, the direction of footsteps, and the myths told beside flickering flame. Sea levels dropped, grasslands expanded, deserts wandered, and amid it all, sapiens adapted not only their tools, but their understanding. In a sense, the cold made meaning visible. Every spark of heat became sacred, every animal path a revelation, every shelter dug into permafrost was both a place to rest and a place to remember. How do you live when the land itself is in hiding? The Earth then was not the Earth we know. Coastlines stretched like ghost limbs into what is now ocean. Britain was not an island, but a high ridge on a vast tundra called Doggerland. Japan was tied to the mainland. Siberia reached eastward and shook hands with North America. Rivers twisted and meandered through channels now submerged, frozen, or forgotten. Valleys that now echo with urban noise once rang with the antler clash of reindeer or the soft scuffle of a snow fox. The world was wider, colder, and paradoxically more interconnected, at least for those who knew how to listen to its patterns. The map we recognise today was still soft clay beneath glacial pressure. Ice redrew the borders of continents, mountains groaned beneath the weight, lakes stretched long and shallow, pooling in the footprints of vanished giants. And under the slow weight of time, human beings moved, not always in great migrations but in smaller arcs, following the firewood, the herd, the thaw. What drives a species to keep walking into the wind? What memory survives when every landmark is wiped clean each spring? What kind of courage blooms in such a landscape? That is where the story truly begins. Because beneath the frozen sky, life was not extinct, it was rearranged. The cold had pressed existence into narrow bands of possibility, and within those bands, life burned brighter. Herds of reindeer and bison moved like rivers of breath across the steppe, carving invisible highways into the snow. Woolly mammoths, the architects of that age, trampled the frozen tundra into plains that shimmered beneath the moon. Wolves shadowed them, patient and persistent. Humans, thin-framed but bright-eyed, walked the edges of this grand procession, reading the land with the precision of instinct honed through generations of hunger. It was a choreography older than memory, every creature drawn into the slow pulse of survival, all under the same indifferent light. The last glacial maximum was not chaos, but symmetry. It revealed the balance of a planet flexing under its own weight, ice at one pole mirrored by deserts at another. Dust carried by wind travelled half the globe before settling in distant lakes, where it would one day become a record of endurance. Beneath the pressure of the ice, mountains fractured. Beneath the stillness of the surface, rivers still ran, hidden, persistent, defiant, each droplet a quiet rebellion against eternity. Even then, the planet was not dying. It was thinking, rehearsing change in slow motion. What did it sound like? That world. The wind, stripped of trees to break its voice, howled across continents with the pitch of a flute played by no one. The nights stretched endlessly, each one a cold cathedral ceiling beneath which humans huddled close to the warmth of their kind. In the absence of distraction, they learned the art of noticing, the glint of frost along a mammoth tusk, the subtle shift in wind that signalled the scent of reindeer, the creak of frozen earth hinting at spring's retreat or return. To live beneath the frozen sky was to see in layers, to understand that meaning was something you excavated, not something given. And though the earth appeared motionless, it was changing quietly. Glacial tongues crawled across valleys, grinding mountains into dust, leaving behind moraines that we still walk upon today. Oceans withdrew, unveiling shelves of land that linked what we now call islands and continents. Across what is now the North Sea, an expanse called Doggerland stretched like a silver plain, alive with deer, aurochs, and human bands who never imagined they stood on borrowed ground. In the distance, where Siberia reached its fingers eastward, Beringia bridged Asia to North America, a frozen highway of migration and myth. But perhaps the greatest transformation was invisible. The Earth's temperature had fallen, yes, but the human mind had deepened. It had adapted to long memory, to long planning, to patience as survival. It began to look inward as much as outward. Beneath that frozen sky, the mind of our species learned to slow down, to listen, to interpret the hidden language of the world. The cold became a teacher. Its lessons were silence, endurance, and the sanctity of warmth. And from that sanctity, a kind of beauty emerged, harsh, fleeting, but unmistakable. It lived in the quiet glint of frost on fur, in the fire's soft exhale against a wall of ice, in the slow rhythm of breath shared between people huddled close. To live beneath the frozen sky was to belong to contrast, to understand that joy was not the absence of suffering, but a brief warmth held within it. For the people of the Upper Paleolithic, beauty was not ornamental. It was a way of recognizing meaning amid scarcity. The curve of a mammoth tusk might become an idol, a song or a memory. The flicker of a flame might carry more awe than sunrise. When survival narrowed the scope of life, imagination widened it again. This world, so quiet to us now, was alive with movement. Herds thundered across permafrost plains, their hooves breaking the rhythm of silence. Wolves sang to one another beneath stars sharper than any we can now see. The air itself glittered with crystals that caught the light of the moon and scattered it like dust from another world. In the midst of this, human eyes reflected that same silver fire, aware not just of the hunt or the hunger, but of the strange stillness that sat behind it all. They were witnesses, small, fragile, enduring witnesses, to something vast and indifferent and yet profoundly sacred. What does awe feel like when the world around you can kill you at any moment? It is not fear, it is reverence. It is the understanding that existence itself is improbable. Every sunrise a victory, every spark a defiance. To those who lived then, fire was not simply warmth. It was a pulse of consciousness, a small and miraculous answer to the great cold beyond. When they gathered around it, they did not merely share food or stories, they shared being. The fire became a circle of identity, a fragile perimeter drawn against the unending white. And beyond that circle, the world continued its ancient, patient motion. Glaciers crept forward with the silence of inevitability, carving their signatures into the bones of the planet. Rivers froze, rerouted, then thawed and flooded in sudden bursts of chaos. Valleys that had been home to mammoth hunters one generation became impassable seas of ice the next. Yet through every shift, humans adapted not by overpowering their world, but by listening to it. They learned to follow the slow tempo of the Earth's breath. They hunted with rhythm, migrated with intuition, rested when the land itself seemed to sleep. To live beneath the frozen sky was to surrender control without surrendering hope. It is hard for us, children of warmth and electricity, to grasp what life meant in a landscape like that. The cold was not only physical, it was spiritual. It entered thought, shaping how people imagined time, community and death. The horizon was a boundary and a promise, a place where ancestors seemed to dwell just beyond the visible. To walk toward it was not only a journey through space, but a passage into myth. Each step was a question. What endures? What disappears? What light is worth keeping? And that question would define them, echoing down through tens of thousands of winters. Because in a world where the land itself could vanish beneath snow or crack open with thaw, permanence was no longer found in stone or structure. It was found in gesture, in memory, in myth. What do you hold on to when nothing holds still? You tell stories. You braid the lives of the dead into the names of rivers, or the shadows of hills. You carve meaning into bone, into ivory, into walls deep inside the earth where the cold cannot reach. These were not decorations. They were anchors, visual echoes to hold the past in place when the horizon shifted, and even the stars seemed to wander. The landscape itself became a living script, and those who moved through it became its readers, interpreters, scribes. Each ridge remembered a crossing. Each clearing might be sacred. They did not name places in the abstract. They recognized them by feeling, by use, by what had happened there. Memory was not a list. It was a map of sensation. That tree is where the old man died in spring. That bend in the river is where the child was born beneath the sky full of lights. Time was not counted but accumulated, layered like snow over the same footprints year after year. And so, when we speak of survival, we must speak of emotion. Because they did not simply endure the cold, they understood it. They did not see themselves as separate from it. The frostbite that took fingers, the wolves that waited at the edges, the thin ice over lakes that lied with silence. All of it was part of the logic of the world. There was no rage at nature, only reverence. You prepared or you perished. But if you lived, there was beauty in that too. There was a kind of grace in being present. What kind of mind does that create? One that watches carefully, one that respects pattern, one that trusts the old stories, and perhaps, above all, one that knows how to wait. Waiting was not passive. It was skilled. You waited for the herds to pass. You waited for the ice to thin. You waited for the moon to crest a certain tree line before telling the child the story about how their grandmother turned into a bird. Waiting was itself a form of knowledge. Under the heavy breath of glaciers, the people of the Upper Paleolithic did not collapse into despair. They built lives filled with rhythm and ritual. With tools shaped from stone and bone, they skinned beasts whose shadows now haunt our imaginations. They crafted needles to sew shelter from hide. They wrapped infants against their skin to borrow each other's warmth. They sang, perhaps. They surely grieved, and they looked at the sky, not in fear but with questions that have not left us. Where does warmth come from when the fire burns low? What remains of us in the cold? Perhaps only the stories. Perhaps only the way we pass them on. Because beneath the frozen sky, even stories had to be shaped to survive. They were not recited. They were practiced. Woven into gesture, ritual, art. Passed hand to hand like fire itself. A carved reindeer placed gently in a grave. a line of ochre dots trailing along a cave wall marking some unknown journey, a mammoth etched in flickering light, its outline breathing in rhythm with the flame. These were not decorations, they were mnemonic spells. Fragments of a map leading back through time, back through hunger and wind and silence, to something like understanding. Not of facts, but of being, and the ice, endless, cruel, beautiful, preserved more than we ever expected. In its memory we find ours. It has kept the pollen of vanished flowers, sealed in the stillness of lake beds. It has held the footprints of children pressed into clay beside wolf tracks. It has buried the bones of those who once knelt to shape flint in the hush of dusk, never knowing that one day we would listen for their breath between layers of snow. We are not their descendants by blood alone. We are their inheritors in awe. So when we look back now and speak of the Upper Paleolithic Ice Age world, we are not just listing conditions or cataloguing tools. We are returning to the origin of attention, to a time when meaning was carved by wind and confirmed in fire, a world where humans were not yet conquerors of nature, but students of its mood, where silence did not mean emptiness, but invitation. What must it have felt like to raise a child in a world that could disappear overnight beneath the snow? What stories did they whisper into the dark to explain the cold, the stars, the fact of breath? And what do we lose when we forget that we once lived that close to the edge? The cold has long retreated. The ice sheets are gone. The steppe has greened into forest, and the coastlines have risen to claim old lands. But the questions remain, and maybe that is the true inheritance. Not the tools or the caves or the bones, but the quiet courage of asking. Beneath the frozen sky, something extraordinary happened. Not an invention, not a war, but a way of seeing, a stillness that taught us how to pay attention, a cold that forced us to gather, to share, to shape meaning from firelight. And if we listen carefully enough, we might still hear it. The breath of those ancient winters, the crackle of a sacred fire, the silence that held the first stories of who we were and who we could be. To walk the Mammoth steppe was to disappear into a world that no longer exists. Not because it was erased, but because it was too vast to be remembered in full. Stretching across what is now western France, through the great belly of Europe, over the Urals, and into the icy breath of Siberia, the Mammoth steppe was a single, unbroken wilderness. A sea of grass and low herbs, bound by neither forest nor desert. It offered no shade, but it gave life to giants. The cold was dry, the light was sharp, and under that light moved a constellation of creatures whose names now sound like myths. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, steppe bison, and reindeer. The architects and keepers of an ecosystem older than agriculture and broader than most empires. But the true character of the Mammoth steppe was not defined by its cold, nor even by its size. It was defined by its rhythm, the way grass grew not in softness but in silence, the way herds rose from the horizon like rolling thunder, the way predators followed, not in ambush, but in parallel migration, shadowing the movements of prey across hundreds of kilometers, year after year. This was no isolated paradise. It was a corridor of continuity, a place where east met west in hoofprints, in tusks, in bones. And for tens of thousands of years, it was also a human homeland. What must it have felt like to stand in that expanse and realize that the world, for once, had no walls, no thick forest to conceal danger, no impassable mountain, only wind and open sky and the long, slow passage of time. For the people of the Upper Paleolithic, the Mammoth steppe was not only a place to survive, it was a place to remember, to learn, to move with purpose, because nothing stayed still for long. The herds dictated the calendar. The grasses told you when the rains had failed. The movement of animals was the language of the land, and you either listened or vanished. And who were these animals, really? Not just meat or tools, not just warmth wrapped in fur. They were presence. The mammoth, towering, slow, social, was the oldest memory carried by the steppe itself. Where mammoths moved, ecosystems followed. Their great tusks cleared pathways through snow. Their feet churned the ground, planting seed and spreading nutrients. In their wake, bison, horses and deer found passage. Lions, hyenas, wolves, and humans followed in slow procession. The mammoth was not prey, it was principle. A keystone in a world that balanced on the breath of grazing herds, and humans? They were small in that equation, but not insignificant. They were observers, interpreters. They read the snow, the droppings, the bends in antler paths. They mapped the invisible, and when the moment was right, they acted. With spears, with coordinated tactics, with the slow patience of those who understood that abundance could vanish in a single mistake. To live on the steppe was to live by rhythm, and rhythm, in time, became knowledge, because the mammoth steppe was not merely a backdrop, it was a teacher, and its lessons came not in words, but in patterns too vast for any one lifetime to witness in full. Yet somehow, the people who lived there knew. They knew the subtle curve of migration routes, the return of the herds not by calendar, but by the angle of light or the pitch of a morning breeze. They could read hoofprints like sentences, find a single hair track among the mosaic of a trampled plain, know from a sliver of dung how far the mammoths had travelled and whether they carried young. Their knowledge was intimate, empirical and embodied, passed not through texts but through gesture, repetition and gaze. And still, knowledge alone was never enough. The land demanded more. It asked for humility, for flexibility. The steppe gave much, but only to those who asked gently. Those who took more than the land could spare left no descendants. The ones who lasted were those who moved with care, who listened for change, who adjusted the shape of their lives not to dominate the wilderness, but to stay in dialogue with it. For here, ecology was not a concept, it was reality. To break the rhythm was to break the possibility of return. What did it mean to live with that much space, that much sky, when the horizon never neared and the land rolled on like a memory just out of reach? Isolation might seem inevitable, but in truth, the mammoth steppe connected more than it separated. It linked regions with shared seasons, mirrored migrations and mirrored minds. Bands of humans crossed paths at choke points, narrow valleys where rivers braided through limestone cliffs, or shallow fords where mammoths drank and left behind a web of prints. These intersections were not always peaceful, but they were always meaningful. Here, knowledge was traded, stories echoed across languages, tools passed from hand to hand, contact shaped culture, and through it all, the animals remained the constant presence, always ahead, always watching. The cave lion, lithe and quiet, moved in shadows just beyond torchlight. The steppe bison, with its massive head and thickly muscled shoulders, turned with uncanny precision to follow the wind. And the mammoth, towering and slow, was a paradox, a creature of power and patience, gentleness and destruction. To see one was to glimpse a moving mountain, to kill one was to gamble against chaos. But when it happened, when the hunt succeeded, it was an event of gravity, a moment that shaped weeks of food, warmth, stories, and songs. And then came the aftermath, bones carved into tools, sinew dried and wound into cord, hide stretched and stitched into shelter, teeth used as anchors for tents or ornaments for children. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be. The steppe was generous but never forgiving. The cold could strip a body bare in minutes. The wind could erase a trail in seconds. Gratitude was not ceremonial, it was survival. What is the shape of a life drawn in ice, muscle, and wind? It is the shape of motion, because stillness, on the steppe, was a kind of death, not only of the body, but of the bond between beings and their land. To stop moving was to step outside the song of the biome, to lose the thread of rhythm that held the vast interwoven lives of herbivore, predator, and human together. And so they moved, across hundreds of kilometres, with the reindeer in spring, with the mammoth in summer, with the wind that brought seed and dust and stories from places far beyond the edge of familiarity. Each journey was not random wandering, but memory in action, retracing routes carved by ancestors, herds, and stars alike. How do you carry home when the ground beneath you changes with every sunrise? You build it not from stone, but from repetition, from return, from remembering the bend in the river where the bison once crossed, or the cave mouth that opens only when the wind shifts. You find shelter in pattern, in the logic of grass, in the weight of snow, in the way the mammoths pause before a storm. The landscape itself became a kind of memory palace, a living archive where knowledge was not stored, but re-experienced year after year. And in that movement, relationships deepened. Between human and animal, between predator and prey, between each other. No one moved alone. Bands moved in harmony, split and reunited. Children grew into trails they had followed since birth. Elders remembered routes now vanished beneath thawing permafrost, and each individual body carried a part of the map, not written, but sung, mimicked, repeated around firelight. Direction was not just where you were going, it was who had walked before you, whose breath still lingered in the grasses. The Mammoth steppe shaped this way of being. Its ecology was expansive but precise. It offered abundance, but only to those who respected its pace. If grasses were overgrazed, herds thinned. If hunts were mistimed, hunger followed. And so, knowledge became ethical, not in the moral sense but in the ecological one. Right timing mattered. Right behaviour mattered. Generosity was not virtue, it was wisdom. You fed those who needed it because one day you might be them. You shared warmth, not from sentiment, but from sense. No one built a surplus that could not be carried. Wealth, in a world of motion, was not what you owned, but what you knew, and who remembered it with you. And still, beneath all this movement, there was ritual. Not grand monuments or temples, but small gestures that bound the moment to meaning. A carved antler left at a crossing. A necklace strung from mammoth ivory given to a child. The rubbing of ochre into the palms before a hunt. These were not symbols. They were anchors, ways to mark the invisible, to steady the soul inside a world that never stopped moving. What kind of person does such a world produce? Someone who walks with the wind but never forgets the fire. Because fire was the only fixed point in a shifting world. It was not simply heat, it was identity. A hearth meant belonging, a perimeter of light drawn against the vastness. A centre of gravity where stories gathered and meaning took shape. When the wind pressed in from the open grasslands and the sky spilled cold like silence, the fire was where memory curled in smoke. There, under skins stretched tight against wood, people leaned in and said things not just to explain, but to bind. They spoke of mammoths who dreamed in the snow, of lions that vanished and returned as ancestors, of grasses that remembered footsteps long after they were gone. And those grasses, the low, frost-resistant sedges and herbs of the steppe, were not mere background. They were the root of everything. In that biome, grass was the first script, the original continuity. It fed the herds, who fed the hunters, who fed the stories. It bent under the wind like a listening ear. It held the snow without surrendering, and in its patience, it sculpted the lives of everything that touched it. Even the bones of the giants, the mammoths, the rhinoceroses, the bison, were shaped by the rhythm of grass. They moved not randomly, but along ancient corridors of forage, repeating routes etched not by instinct alone, but by inheritance. This ecology was more than a collection of species, it was a choreography, each animal a note in a composition playing over millennia. Humans were not conductors, nor spectators, but participants, obliged to learn the music or fall into dissonance. And in that dance, the line between survival and reverence began to blur. To track a herd was not just a means to food, it was a way of staying in sync with the pulse of the land. To make tools was to engage in dialogue, with bone, with flint, with the spirit of movement itself. A broken point could mean starvation, a sharp edge could mean a successful hunt or the saving of a child. But it wasn't only tools they shaped, it was thought, it was relationship. They carved mammoth ivory into figures, not always clear in purpose, but clear in care. They etched the lines of animal bodies with precision that defies casual explanation. These were not idle marks. They were a form of speech, of remembering, of weaving the animal into the self into the animal, the moment into the eternal. The people of the steppe did not stand above their world. They walked within it with a humility born not of weakness, but of deep understanding. What does it mean to thrive in a world so unforgiving? Perhaps it means becoming more than an individual. Perhaps it means becoming a rhythm yourself. A pulse of breath that matches the wind. A heartbeat that knows when to be still, when to listen, and when to move. The people who lived on the Mammoth steppe were not defined by architecture or writing or war. They were defined by presence. Their minds were shaped not by conquest but by coordination, with each other, with the animals they followed, and with the land that watched them pass. To them, intelligence was not extraction, it was attention. And in that vast open world, the most valuable skill was not invention, but memory. They remembered where the bison calved, which pass opened first with spring, how the snow drifted differently in bad years. They remembered the exact tilt of land that meant water would rise from the permafrost, the colour of grass just before it failed, the scent of reindeer when the rut began. Memory was not abstract, it was sensory. It lived in fingers, in footsteps, in the quiet murmur between generations when no words were needed. And if they remembered well, they could return. If they returned, they could continue. That was the quiet promise of the steppe, not safety, not plenty, but continuity. You had to earn it. And when the weather turned, or the herds shifted, or the predators closed in, there was no one to blame. There was only the land, and whether you had listened well enough to remain. But even in loss they left traces. Scattered campsites where stones had been knapped. Bones arranged in patterns that might have been practical, or spiritual, or both. Charcoal buried in the soil, carrying the ghost of firelight that once danced on someone's face. These traces are faint now, but they are real. And they tell us something elemental. The Mammoth steppe was not just a place. It was a state of mind, a way of being in constant dialogue with change, in reverence for movement and in awe of scale. What echoes linger in such a place, long after the herds have gone and the grasses have changed? Perhaps only this, that for tens of thousands of years there existed a corridor across the roof of the world, a golden and wind-swept plain where giants walked and humans walked with them, not behind, not ahead, with. It is easy to forget that, easy to reduce those lives to tools and bones and timelines. But to do so is to lose the feeling of that wind, the way it pressed against the face like memory, the way it carried the sound of hooves like a heartbeat that was not your own, but somehow still inside you. The Mammoth steppe was not ours. It was shared, briefly, and then, like all beautiful things, it passed into silence. But silence is not absence, it is invitation, to remember, to imagine, to walk again, in thought, through a world where nothing stood still and everything was alive with motion. To enter one of the painted caves of the Upper Paleolithic is to cross a threshold not just of stone, but of time, of presence, of breath. The silence changes, the air thickens, and somewhere in that blackness, far from the sun, a wall begins to shimmer, not with paint, but with intention. A bison stares back from the rock, its flanks pulsing with red ochre. A horse gallops, frozen mid-stride, its legs made of curve and shadow, and above it all, a handprint, pressed against the stone like a whisper that has waited 20,000 years to be heard. These are not the works of idle hands. These are not decorations. They are remnants of an ancient language, one that began not with words, but with image, with echo, with breath. What must it have felt like to stand in the cave at Chauvet, torch in hand, the smoke curling around your skin, watching those animals move in the flicker of flame? What stirred the mind to press pigment against rock, to trace the curve of antler and shoulder, to bring into the dark a thing glimpsed only in daylight? These were not places of shelter. They were sanctuaries. The caves of Chauvet, Altamira, Lascaux, El Castillo, each one a cathedral of memory, carved not upward, but inward. The further you travelled into their depth, the more the world outside began to fall away. Sound grew still, time stilled, and in that silence, something breathed. There is a strange and quiet intimacy in the placement of these paintings. They were never meant to be seen by many. They are often hidden, tucked behind blind corners, in chambers that require crawling, squeezing, surrendering. Some lie dozens of metres beneath the earth, far past the point of comfort. Which begs the question, who were they for? Not the community, not the hunter, not the child on their first winter walk. These images were for the ones who walked between worlds, for the dreamers, the speakers, the ones who returned from the dark carrying something unspoken. And perhaps that is why they remain so hauntingly alive. Because they were not drawn to be seen, they were drawn to be felt. Fire was the first brush, flame, the first animator. No sunlight ever reached those walls, and so light had to be brought down like a burden. Carried in bundles of pine resin, torches of bark, the artist worked in shifting gold and shadow, watching their creatures come alive only in motion. They traced the swell of a horse's belly, the arc of a horn, the piercing eye of a feline not by outline alone, but by how the flame moved across the stone. In the flicker, the bison leapt. In the smoke, the mammoth walked. Is it still art when it moves with fire and disappears with silence? Or is it something older than art? Because before beauty, before adornment or expression for its own sake, there was the need to remember, to fix experience in place, to take the ephemeral world of hoofbeats, of breath, of danger, and give it a body that could outlast the moment. Ochre became the voice, manganese, the shadow, charcoal, the line between life and myth. These substances were not just pigments, they were ancestral. Ochre in particular had been used for tens of thousands of years before the first bison appeared on the wall of Chauvet. It marked the dead, painted the living, sealed wounds, softened hides. It was sacred through use, not belief. In the caves, ochre became memory itself. It carried the hand into the deep and left its mark, not always in animals but in symbols too, dots, lines, grids, signs that echo across continents and millennia. No Rosetta Stone deciphers them, yet they repeat with such persistence that they begin to hum with familiarity. They seem less like decoration, and more like invocation. Perhaps each was a spell or a tally, or the syllables of a forgotten prayer. Perhaps they were maps, not of land, but of spirit. We do not know, and maybe we're not meant to. Mystery, after all, was part of the medium, but not everything in these caves is abstract. The animals, the hands, the scenes, they are vivid. Lascaux alone holds over 600 painted figures, bulls with wide eyes and impossible scale, deer whose antlers tangle into the curve of the wall, ibex mid-leap, always moving. The walls are not passive surfaces, they are collaborators. Artists shape their subjects to the natural contours of the stone, making backs curve with bulges, haunches swell with cracks, horns emerge from the suggestion of a shadow. There is no background. The cave itself breathes through the image. And then there is Altamira, the Sistine Chapel of prehistory, though the comparison feels both grand and misplaced, because what lies on the ceiling there is not ambition, it is awe. The bison are layered, textured, shaded. Some lie still, others twist, their forms outlined in red and black, as if burned into the rock by thought. You lie beneath them as you look up, and the position is no accident. These images were made to be seen from rest, from ritual, perhaps from trance. There is a stillness in them that speaks of something beyond survival. This was not about the hunt. It was about relationship. What kind of mind conceives of such images not as display but as offering? What kind of world do you live in when your art can only exist in darkness, lit by fire and felt in silence? Perhaps one where spirit is not a belief, but a presence you meet in stone. Because these caves were not galleries, they were thresholds. Every step into the dark was a descent, not into hell, not into safety, but into depth. The same depth where dreams begin. The same depth where language was still becoming possible. Imagine walking for hundreds of meters with nothing but torchlight, the flame guttering, smoke curling against the ceiling, the air dense with breath and echo. Then silence. Only the crack of sap in the wood, the slow drip of water from limestone teeth above. You lift the light and the wall awakens, animals everywhere, moving, merging, watching you as if you had interrupted something ancient still in progress. This was not performance, it was communion. The artists who painted here were not mere illustrators, they were translators. They carried visions from one realm to another, from the known to the unknowable. Fire was their brush, pigment their pulse, and the wall itself their witness. In their world there was no firm division between the living and the dead, between the human and the animal, between what was seen and what was dreamt. Everything was continuous. The spirit of the mammoth might be in the flame. The voice of a bison might echo in the throat of the singer. The boundary between them was smoke, thin, shimmering, gone with a breath. And that breath, it is still there. The very act of painting in those chambers required breath, exhaling ochre dust, blowing pigment through hollow bones to create silhouettes. The first form of aerosol art. Every handprint is the fossil of an exhalation. You can almost hear it still. The breath of someone who lived 20,000 years ago, carried through pigment, sealed in darkness, waiting. These hands are not signatures. They are testaments. Proof that once, in a time we call prehistoric, someone stood here, fully human, and wanted to be remembered. Not by name, but by presence. We often talk about art as a reflection of humanity's awakening, as if before this there was only instinct. But what if it was the other way around? What if humanity was the reflection, the shadow cast by art itself? Because to imagine is to create distance, and to create distance is to recognize yourself as something separate, alive, observing. In these caves, consciousness left its echo on stone. These are not the beginnings of civilization. They are the beginnings of awareness. Look at how carefully they chose their materials. The artist ground ochre and charcoal, mixed them with fat or spit to bind the colour. They experimented with layering and shading, with engraving and engraving again. They understood perspective, not in the mathematical sense, but in the visceral one. They knew that an animal seen by firelight was never still. They painted not what was seen, but what was felt. The movement, the pulse beneath the skin, the breath shared between hunter and prey. Perhaps that is why, even now when we look into those dark walls, we feel watched. Not in fear, but in recognition. Something looks back. Not an eye, not a being, but a feeling, an echo of presence, a question maybe, or an invitation. The animals are not passive subjects in these spaces. They are agents, witnesses, spirits perhaps that once walked above ground and were brought here, not to be conquered, but to be honoured. There is reverence in their rendering, an attention so specific, so tender, it borders on the sacred. These were not trophies, they were relatives. And the caves? The caves were not just places to depict them, they were places to meet them. So what was this then? Ritual, prayer, dream? The answer might be all three. Ritual in this context does not mean routine, it means participation, a way of entering a different state. The descent into darkness was likely not accidental or casual. It required preparation, quieting, perhaps fasting, perhaps chant. Fire and pigment became tools not of art, but of transformation. The hand that painted the bison may not have been the same hand that returned from the cave hours later. Something passed through them, or perhaps they passed through something. It's no wonder that some of the earliest flutes carved from bird bone are found in the same layers as these paintings. Sound, like image, was a thread between worlds. Imagine the high, reedy music echoing through those tight stone chambers. Imagine the play of shadows and flame, the rising smoke, the hum of voices not speaking, but intoning. This was not ceremony in the modern sense, it was ceremony as survival, a way of staying aligned with forces vast and invisible, a way of remembering that life was never lived alone, because to be alone, in that world, was to vanish. Community was not a luxury, it was a law. The caves may have only held a few at a time, but what happened inside them rippled outward. The images once made became part of the group's shared knowledge, part of their mythology. They were visited, revisited, touched. Some were added to across generations, others were preserved untouched, as if complete from the start. There was discernment in what was sacred and what was not. The cave was not a canvas, it was a companion, a place you returned to when the world felt too thin, when you needed to touch the deeper thread, and that thread is not broken. It stretches to us now, thousands of years later across silence and stone. We walk into these caves today with headlamps and guided tours, with carbon dating and scanning lasers, but the ancient breath still lingers, the quiet still hums. We know what we're seeing, but do we know what we're feeling? Because art that was never made to be seen still sees us. It reaches across the dark, across the centuries, not as spectacle but as memory. not as performance, but as presence. These images, these ochre spirits on stone, were not painted for admiration. They were acts of anchoring, a way to keep something from drifting away. A way to remind themselves, and now us, that the world is alive and we are not its masters. The people who crept into those caverns were not primitive. They were perceptive. They paid attention to the world not only with their eyes, but with their skin, with their breath, with their dreams. And that attention was worship, in the deepest sense. Not directed at gods, perhaps, but at connection, at the deep truth that to live meant to be part of a world greater than oneself, a world that included the bison and the lion, and the cave bear, and the river's course, and the red handprint glowing in torchlight. In this world view, art was not an object. It was an action. It was an offering. And that offering was a way of aligning the self with the cycles of everything else. Even now, when archaeologists describe these works, they struggle with language. They use terms like symbolic behaviour or complex cognition, or emergent spirituality. But the artists of the caves didn't think in such categories. They didn't need to. They felt. They followed. They painted what mattered. They returned to the same places again and again because something was there, something that couldn't be hunted, or eaten, or touched, but only honoured. And we, modern, restless, full of data, step into those caves and grow quiet. Because something in the walls still speaks, not in words, but in presence, in a bison's curve, in a hand's outline, in the subtle tilt of a torchlit line that turns a crack into a spine, a hollow into a flank. The cave breathes, and we listen. And in that moment, we are no longer alone. What survives is not the pigment, it's the gesture. The decision to reach out and leave a mark, the will to remember, the courage to descend into darkness and make something last. That is what echoes through these sanctuaries. That is what passes from one breath to another, even now. Not beauty, not glory, but presence. So when we speak of the Upper Paleolithic, let us not speak only of tools and diets, migrations and bone. Let us speak of the quiet, of the stillness between torch flickers, of the pulse behind the paint. Let us speak of the ones who went into the dark and returned changed, and who left, behind them, the trail we now follow. The cave does not explain itself. It invites, it opens, it breathes, and it waits. Something changed. Not in the world, but in the way the world was seen. Somewhere, in the long twilight of the Ice Age, a spark lit behind the eyes of early humans. Not all at once, and not in every mind, but slowly, across scattered bands beneath the frozen sky, something began to stir. A shift so subtle it left no footprint, but so profound it left echoes in everything that followed. This was not the awakening of intelligence. That had long existed. It was the awakening of meaning. But how do you notice a revolution when it leaves no cities, no monuments, no scrolls of law? You notice it in the red dust of ochre packed into graves, in the way a body is laid not as refuse but with care, in positions that suggest a story. You notice it in the pierced teeth strung as beads, in the shell traded from a distant shore, in the flint blade tucked beside the skull. These are not the marks of survival. They are the marks of symbolism. And symbolism is a dangerous, beautiful thing. Because once something can mean more than itself, it never goes back to being just what it was. The world did not change, but the mind did. And with it came a quiet revolution, a way of thinking that spiraled outward into myth, language, memory. This revolution was not marked by fire or violence, but by gesture, by the burial of a child, by the pressing of ochre into the earth, by the first person who knelt beside the dead and did not simply leave but lingered. Perhaps they wept, perhaps they whispered, perhaps they laid a stone that meant something, not to the body, but to those who remained. And in doing so, they created something new, remembrance. Why bury the dead at all? Why not leave them to the wind, the scavenger, the drift of time? The answer is not survival, it is recognition. To bury is to say, this was someone, and even more than that, it is to say, I will carry them forward in my mind. The earliest graves are not loud. They are not full of riches or power. They are quiet places marked by absence, but they show something enormous, the presence of presence. A mind that can remember is a mind that can mourn. And a mind that can mourn is no longer just surviving, it is imagining. Imagination was the breach, the line crossed, the bridge from now to then, from this world to whatever might lie beyond. Once that leap was made, nothing would ever be simple again. A stone was no longer just a stone, a red smear no longer just iron dust. They were signs, carriers of thought, vessels of story. In that moment the symbolic mind was born, not shouted into being but breathed, slowly, unstoppably. What happens when the mind learns to see what isn't there? You begin to live in two worlds at once, the tangible and the imagined, the seen and the remembered. This is the quiet miracle of the symbolic mind. It allows absence to become presence. The mother who dies is no longer gone. She exists in story, in dream, in ritual gesture. The child who wanders too far can still be called back through words, through signs carved into wood or whispered into wind. The invisible becomes real through the act of thought. And once that boundary dissolves, meaning begins to take root in everything. In this world, ochre was not just colour, it was life, blood, protection, continuity. We find it scattered through burials, pressed into the creases of hands, dusted across bones that have lain for 30,000 years. Why ochre? Why this specific pigment, drawn from earth the colour of sunset? Perhaps it resembled the blood that left the body, or the glow of firelight that kept night at bay. Whatever its meaning, it was chosen again and again, across continents and millennia. A shared intuition that red could speak could hold something sacred between the living and the dead. At Sungir, in the Russian plain, 2 children were buried side by side, their small bodies draped in beads, thousands of ivory ornaments painstakingly shaped and polished by hand. It would have taken hundreds of hours to make them. No society wastes that kind of time on nothing. It was an act of devotion, of reverence, of love. Their bones tell us they were frail, their deaths young, and yet the community adorned them as if they were royalty, not kings and queens, but symbols, anchors of something larger than life itself. Nearby, at Kafza in the Levant, a young woman rests in a shallow grave. Her skull is dusted with ochre, and beside her lies a child. Their bones are arranged, not scattered. Their faces were once turned toward each other. Even 40,000 years later, the positioning feels deliberate, an act of tenderness. The gesture itself transcends time. It says, we cared. We knew loss. We honoured it. Through these burials we glimpse the dawn of something profound, the idea that existence could have meaning beyond breath. Death became not just an ending, but a question. What happens next? Where does the spirit go? And perhaps more hauntingly, how do we remain connected to those who've crossed into that unseen place? To bury was to answer that question with action. The grave became a message written to the beyond, a way of saying, you still matter. And from that, myth was born, not as superstition, but as empathy extended through imagination. To tell a story about death is to refuse to accept it fully, to name what cannot be touched. The first myths were not about gods. They were about grief. They were about remembering, about holding something in language that could not be held in hands. What happens to a world where thought becomes symbol and symbol becomes story? It becomes human. Because once the world could be named, it could also be shared. Meaning was no longer private. It could be passed from one mind to another like fire. The moment 2 people agreed that a sound, a shape, or a gesture could stand for something unseen, the boundary between minds softened. Thought became collective. And in that shared space a new force emerged. Language. Not the grunts and cries of instinct, but something deliberate, layered, recursive. A system not just for warning or calling, but for remembering, for imagining, for building worlds that did not yet exist. We do not know when the first true words were spoken, but we know what they must have felt like. The awe of realizing you could summon a memory into sound, and have someone else see it too. To say fire and watch another's gaze turn toward the flame. To say bison and recall the great herds together. To speak the name of the dead and feel the air tremble with presence. This was not simply communication, it was communion, a mind touching another mind across the silence. Language was the great unifier of the symbolic mind. It stitched individuals into community, and community into story. Around the fires of the Ice Age world, words replaced the need for permanence. Memory became portable. You didn't need a monument if you could tell the tale of what happened. The story itself became the monument, carried from voice to voice, generation to generation. In this way, language became the architecture of continuity. Through it, ideas could outlive bodies, knowledge could move farther than footprints, and with this, jewellery and adornment took on new resonance. A bead, a tooth, a shell. These were no longer just ornaments. They were statements of belonging, small messages encoded in form. To wear them was to say, I am part of this story. The ivory bracelets of Sungir, the shell necklaces from Blombos Cave, the carved bone pendants of Europe, all are echoes of identity spoken without sound. Each one was a symbol, a memory made visible, a piece of language worn against the skin, but language also transformed thought itself. It allowed abstraction, the ability to speak of what wasn't here, to plan, to promise, to remember the past and imagine the future. Before language, thought was bound to the moment. With language, thought became time travel. The symbolic mind could now stretch across hours, years, lifetimes. Memory became networked, layered, collective. Knowledge ceased to die with the individual. It lived on in story. And in story, death softened, meaning deepened. The first myths, those told around the embers of the Paleolithic night, were not grand cosmologies. They were bridges, between breath and silence, between the living and the gone, between what could be touched and what could only be felt. They were, in essence, love preserved through imagination. This was the dawn of the inner world, the place where memory, symbol, and emotion intertwine, and with it came the birth of something even more enduring. Culture. Not simply in the sense of tools or artifacts, but in the invisible thread that tied people together, shared meanings, shared stories, shared rituals. As the symbolic mind flourished, so too did the sense of belonging to something larger than the self. A band of hunter-gatherers became more than a group bound by food and proximity. They became a people, and to be a people meant having memory, not just personal, but collective. Collective memory is what allowed a small human group to become a lineage to become a tradition. Once a story was told, it could be remembered, revised, retold. Once a burial practice was begun, it could be repeated, adapted, passed down. Culture became the vessel through which the symbolic mind expressed itself, not in isolation but in chorus. Each generation added their verse, not always in words, but through gesture, artifact, placement. A grave was a sentence, a painted shell, a syllable. And so, through culture, death became less frightening, because it no longer meant disappearance, it meant transformation. To die was to return to the story, to join the ancestors, to re-enter the myth. This is why, even today, our oldest languages are thick with metaphor. We don't say die, we say pass on, go to sleep, return to the earth. These are not euphemisms, they are echoes, ripples of the symbolic revolution that began tens of thousands of years ago. This capacity to see beyond what is, and speak as if it were still present, laid the groundwork for everything we now call spirituality. Not religion in the organised sense, but spirituality as the awareness that life is more than flesh and motion, that there is something beneath it, behind it, around it. The symbolic mind made space for that awareness, and language gave it form. With this came the first rituals, the first ceremonies, the first attempts to reach beyond the visible world and communicate with something larger, be it ancestor, animal spirit, or memory itself. Some scholars argue this shift was inevitable, that as the brain grew more complex, symbolic thought was bound to emerge. But inevitability does not explain the softness with which it came. There was no explosion, no clear beginning, just the slow layering of care, of remembrance, of meaning placed carefully into the ground. It is the gentleness of this revolution that makes it feel so profound. It crept in quietly, like mist into a valley, and reshaped the world without leaving scars. Even now, in our most intimate moments, holding a photograph, whispering a name into silence, wearing a ring passed down from a grandparent, we echo those first symbolic gestures. We do not need to remember them consciously. The shape of their thought is still etched into us. It lives in how we grieve, how we dream, how we hope, and how we tell stories, not just to entertain, but to endure. Because a story is more than an account. It is a vessel, a shape that holds the unspeakable, the fleeting, the sacred. For the early humans of the Ice Age, storytelling was not a pastime. It was an act of survival, of orientation, of spiritual grounding. Each tale held the memory of a hunt, a loss, a warning, a joy, and told in rhythm, in repetition, around a fire or whispered in the dark, these stories wove meaning into the cold silence of the world. Language gave the symbolic mind its wings, but storytelling gave it flight. And through story, the earliest humans formed something rare and astonishing: continuity. Their world was filled with abrupt endings, of seasons, of lives, of warmth. But the story was what did not end. It was what bound the past to the present and pointed toward a future that had not yet arrived. In the depths of caves, in the hushed moments of burial, in the tracing of symbols across a rock face the same impulse stirred. Remember this, pass this on. We do not know the names of those who first dared to dream aloud. We do not know the words they used, the voices they spoke in, but we know they existed, because we feel the shape of their thinking in us still. The urge to name the stars, to mark a place, to tell a child not just how the world works, but why it matters. These are not new instincts. They are ancient, so old, in fact, that they no longer feel like inventions. They feel like us. What began as a quiet revolution of red ochre and grave goods became the invisible scaffold of the human spirit. Over time, this scaffold would support religions, philosophies, sciences, and art. But its foundation lies in something humble: the burial of a body, the shape of a shell, the curve of a story carried on the tongue. It was not about power, it was about presence, and presence once imagined never truly disappears. The symbolic mind is not only our heritage, it is our mirror. It shows us that the human journey is not a straight ascent, but a deepening, a growing ability to feel, to connect, to carry. Through ochre, through ritual, through language and myth, early humans began to live lives shaped by more than necessity. They began to live lives textured by meaning. And so, beneath the sky of ice, where survival alone was already a triumph, something else began to bloom. Not in the soil, but in the soul. A flowering of the invisible, a turning inward that allowed our ancestors not just to endure the world, but to interpret it, reflect it, and ultimately shape it. This was not merely adaptation, it was imagination. And it is through that imagination that we inherit the deepest parts of ourselves. The mind awakened, and in doing so, made the world awake with it. The story of survival is not written only in bones or firelight. It is written in the edge of a blade. Somewhere between the frozen plains and the quiet forests, the Ice Age human did something that no other creature had ever done. They shaped not just their world, but the future of their thinking, with stone. Flint was not new. Millions of years earlier, it had been cracked crudely by ancestors in warmer, wilder lands. But in the Upper Paleolithic, something shifted. The flakes became thinner, the cores more deliberate, the strikes more predictive. This was no longer brute force. This was craft. This was thought made visible. How does a mind come to know a rock as if it were part of itself? To nap flint is to read silence. You must listen to the fracture within. Imagine the line that does not yet exist, and then summon it with a blow. The blade that results is not merely sharp, it is a signature. Each flake, each retouched edge, carries the echo of intention. And from intention, a kind of memory is born. These were not just tools, they were sentences in a language spoken through the body, and as the tools refined, so did the bodies that wielded them. The hand and the mind evolved together, a spiral of mutual influence. Anatomists call it the precision grip, the human ability to press the thumb against the tips of fingers, cradling fine objects with exquisite control. It is easy to take for granted. But behind this simple gesture lies a long history of coordination, practice, and need. The The thumb became more than anatomy, it became destiny. By the time the Ice Age entered its late stages, the blade was no longer a single-purpose item. It had become modular, hafted onto spears, fixed into bone handles, or slotted into complex hunting tools. This change was subtle, but profound. It meant that tools could now outlive the moment of their making. They could be repaired, swapped, passed on. Technology had become durable, and with that durability came culture. Knowledge no longer vanished with death. It could be preserved in form. Is this when survival became something more than instinct? Perhaps it was here, in the cold grip of necessity, that culture emerged not just as expression, but as infrastructure. A tradition of making, refining, transmitting. A flint blade was no longer just a thing. It was a bridge, from one mind to another, from one generation to the next. It allowed thought to persist beyond its origin, to be inherited without words, to be known through the hand. And so, the blade cut not only meat or sinew, it cut time. It carved a path through the unknown, and in doing so, left behind the first shapes of what it meant to be human. Because each tool was not just a solution, it was a thought made tangible. The flint blade, the carved antler point, the smooth bone needle, they all carried within them an invisible lineage of minds. To hold one was to hold the memory of another's learning. The rhythm of blows, the choice of stone, the subtle control of angle and force. All of it was a language without words, passed through generations not by speech, but by repetition. And in that repetition, something miraculous happened. Knowledge began to accumulate. No longer did every individual start from nothing. A young hunter could watch, imitate, and improve. A toolmaker could take a known shape and make it sharper, lighter, more efficient. The invention of precision was not a single moment. It was a conversation that lasted millennia. The bones of reindeer and mammoth became handles, extensions of the self. Antler tips hardened in fire became chisels. Ivory and bone were carved into awls and barbed points. And every refinement whispered of a growing intelligence that saw potential not just in the material, but in the unseen possibilities it held. The shaping of stone became the shaping of time. For the first time in history, humans began to plan ahead in 3 dimensions: material, purpose, and consequence. They could look at a core of flint and see a dozen tools hidden within it, waiting to be revealed. This was vision, not of faith, but of foresight. The flake was no longer an accident, it was design. The world itself became malleable, a medium of mind. And from this precision came distance. The human hand, now capable of crafting blades and points of deadly accuracy, reached farther than ever before. Spears were no longer hurled by strength alone, they were cast with strategy. The atlatl, or spear thrower, extended the arm, amplified the throw, and multiplied the range. This was not merely a technological leap, it was a cognitive one. To use an atlatl is to anticipate, to think beyond the body's limit, to project force through space and time. The toolmaker had become a tactician. The hunt had become geometry. The atlatl transformed not only the hunt but the hunter. It redefined danger. No longer did a person have to stand within striking distance of the mammoth or the bison. The weapon made space, physical but also psychological. The mind began to map trajectories, to visualize flight paths, to plan outcomes. It was the birth of abstract strategy. Every throw was a hypothesis. Every impact, a test. And so, with each flake of flint, each carved groove in antler, each throw that found its mark, the human world widened. Survival was no longer just reaction. It was anticipation. Thought moved faster than muscle. The body followed the imagination, and with that came a new kind of confidence, the understanding that the world could be shaped, not merely endured. The hand had become an instrument, the mind a forge, and through that forge new forms emerged, not only more effective but more distinct. Across the vast continents of the Ice Age world, as bands of humans moved through river valleys, across glacial plains, and beneath wind-carved cliffs, their tools began to carry the fingerprints of identity. A blade found in the Dordogne might differ in shape from one made near the Don River. A spear point from the Gravettian culture would not be mistaken for the fluted tools of the later Clovis. These were not random variations. They were patterns, signatures, early echoes of something that would one day be called style. Style, in this context, was not about aesthetic flourish. It was about transmission, a way of marking tools, and therefore people, as part of a lineage. Within a region, generations might produce variations on a theme, a notched point, a split base, a curved scraper edge. These subtleties, invisible to the untrained eye, were full of meaning. They told you who had passed this way. They told you what was known, what was remembered. They marked the boundaries of knowledge and its bridges. This was the dawn of regional cultures, not defined by kings or cities, but by bone, stone, and repetition. Technology became geography. Ideas travelled, but slowly, along the paths of migration and trade. A single innovation, a new blade style, a better hafting method, could spread outward like ripples, mingling with local practices, evolving as it moved. The archaeological record preserves these layers like sediment, each culture a fossil of mind in motion. And as tools became more complex, so too did the social worlds that produced them. The act of tool-making itself may have become communal, elders demonstrating techniques, children watching, then trying, perhaps even rituals surrounding the first successful flake struck from a core. In this way, a region's toolkit was also its curriculum, a shared knowledge base, silent, durable, and alive in the hands of its people. This is why even broken blades and spent cores hold such fascination for archaeologists. They are not debris. They are memory. Memory of choice, of skill, of practice. The small shards of worked flint scattered across a cave floor are not random. They are sentences, spoken in stone, left behind by someone who once breathed, someone who once imagined this shape before it was real. Over time, the diversity of tools would grow, not only across space but across function. Scrapers, burins, awls, needles, fishing hooks, harpoons, all point to a world no longer bound to a single mode of living. These weren't just survival items, they were expressions of a growing mind, increasingly attuned to the nuances of its world. A world of seasons, of animals, of tasks both daily and sacred. The blade had begun as necessity, but now it was something more, a reflection, of thought, of belonging, of place. It was survival, shaped in the image of identity. And identity itself became a landscape, mapped not in borders or flags, but in flint and antler, in the angle of a notch or the polish of a bone handle. In the Ice Age, tools were not just things you used, they were things you inherited, things you recognized, things that told you who you were. Culture began to live not only in the stories passed around firelight, but in the very shape of the objects in your hand. When archaeologists uncover tools from the Solutrean culture in what is now southwestern Europe, they find blades that are astonishingly thin, double-pointed, and leaf-shaped. These weren't simply practical, they were precise to a level that suggests hours of investment, a kind of loving attention to symmetry and form. And that care tells a story, not just about how to survive, but about how to do so beautifully, deliberately, with respect for the lineage behind you and the people beside you. These were the first things made not just to work, but to be seen. Form began to follow something deeper than function. It followed memory. It followed pride. When one person made a blade in a specific style, they were linking themselves to a chain of others who had done the same. Perhaps they were trained by a parent, or honoured a lost elder by keeping the old form alive. Perhaps they believed that a certain shape brought luck or was favoured by spirits. Whatever the case, the shape of the tool became a kind of signature. And with that, the idea of belonging crystallised, not just to a place, but to a people. And so, technology gave rise to something that no other creature on Earth had fully achieved: intergenerational consciousness. Not just learning by instinct or mimicking a parent's behaviour, but learning through tools that embodied the thinking of others. With every sharpened edge, humans held in their hands the thoughts of those who had come before. This is how culture builds, not with sudden leaps, but through slow, steady refinement. A barbed spear point here, a lighter handle there, a way to carve bone that prevents splitting, a technique for straightening wood over fire. None of these acts, on their own, are revolutionary, but together they form the bedrock of continuity. They create a kind of invisible scaffolding for survival. And in this scaffolding, community is born, Because once you share a toolkit, you share a reality. You share a way of doing things. And that shared way becomes a world view. It becomes custom. It becomes law. In this way, the toolkit was not just a box of parts. It was a philosophy, one that was carried, practiced and renewed with every generation. A quiet code written in stone and bone, whispering across millennia. We were here. We knew this. We shaped this. And that whisper echoes still. Because these early tools were more than innovations. They were the first expressions of long-term thinking, of sustained attention passed like a flame from one mind to another. They allowed human beings to externalize their memory, to anchor knowledge in material things, and to outlive the fallibility of flesh. And in doing so, they forged the first link in the chain of what would become human history, not as a tale of kings and wars, but as the story of minds meeting across time through the quiet intimacy of making. The needle carved from bird bone and the barbed harpoon from reindeer antler, the perfectly fluted Clovis point, the finely retouched Gravettian blade, these were not improvisations. They were evidence of curriculum. They demanded teaching, practice, standards, and a memory deep enough to preserve process. And in their careful shaping lies the first promise of civilization, that knowledge can be saved, improved, and shared. But even as tools became more complex, the environments in which they were used remained wild, unpredictable, and immense. The Upper Paleolithic was still a world of flux, of advancing glaciers, shifting rivers, and migrations that stretched across thousands of kilometers. In such a world, survival required more than cleverness. It required the ability to preserve stability within motion, to maintain continuity in the face of change. This is where tools served as anchors. Wherever humans went, the toolkit followed. Sometimes it evolved, sometimes it adapted, but it was never abandoned. It was home, not in a physical structure, but in a set of shared practices. It allowed Ice Age humans to take with them not just their belongings, but their identity, to rebuild, to re-inhabit, to re-establish meaning wherever they arrived. The toolkit was also a mirror. It showed each group who they were, how they saw the world, and what they valued. A community that invested time in elaborate spear points told a different story than one that perfected needles for fine clothing or specialized in engraving bone. Each focus reflected an ecology, a strategy, a set of priorities. The landscape shaped the tools, and the tools in turn shaped how the landscape was seen, used, and remembered. This, perhaps, is the most profound legacy of the tools of the Upper Paleolithic. They taught humans how to see, to read the land for material, to read the flint for fractures, to read the past for patterns, to look ahead, not just to tomorrow's hunt, but to the next season, the next journey, the next generation. And so the shape of survival became the shape of the self. The blade became an extension of thought, the needle of memory, the atlatl of reach. And each object, however small or humble, carried with it the breath of a mind reaching forward. This was not the beginning of humanity, but it was the beginning of something just as powerful, the beginning of intention. They are gone, and yet they are still here. Walk through the corridors of your own DNA, and you may find them waiting. Quiet passengers in the bloodstream of modern humanity, traces of a people long vanished, whose voices once echoed in the same winds that shaped our earlier songs. Neanderthals, a name heavy with both awe and misconception. We did not conquer them in battle. We did not outwit them in some clean contest of supremacy. Instead, their absence arrived like the fading of breath on cold glass, subtle, gradual, and without the thunder of endings. What happens when a kindred species disappears not in fire but in silence? For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals ranged across the forests and steppes of Eurasia. They were not primitive brutes, nor shadows cowering in our evolutionary past. They were skilled hunters, stone tool artisans, and social creatures who knew fire, who buried their dead, who painted with ochre, and who likely spoke in voices more familiar than we might care to admit. And then, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago, they were gone. But not entirely. Today their legacy lingers within us, etched into the very matter of who we are. Almost all non-African humans carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, between 1 and 2%, a genetic echo that suggests interbreeding, not extermination. They were not merely replaced, they were absorbed, gradually and incompletely, into the swelling tide of Homo sapiens expanding into their lands. This overlap is written not just in genes, but in stone and ash. Archaeological sites like those at Vindia in Croatia or Châtelperron in France, where the artefacts of both lineages blur and blend, where it becomes impossible to say who touched what or who taught whom. And so, a new kind of question emerges. Not just what happened to the Neanderthals, but what does it mean to be the species that survived? Did we outlast them because of language, or numbers, or the capacity for abstraction? Or was it geography, chance, climate? Did we move like a rising tide, overwhelming slower currents? Or was it quieter than that? Cohabitation, intermingling, and eventual dilution? Perhaps no single answer is sufficient. Perhaps their extinction was not a moment, but a long twilight, a tapering presence beside our own. Perhaps we walked together for centuries, sharing the same rivers, the same game trails, the same fears. And if we did, what passed between us in those dusk-lit crossings? There is something profoundly human in the need to understand a disappearance, to not only study it, but to grieve it. We recognize that something was lost, not just in the vanishing of a population, but in the fading of a different way of being, a different mind, a different rhythm to life. When the last Neanderthal died, somewhere in a cave or under an open sky, something ancient and sacred passed into silence, and we were the ones left to carry the memory. But memory is fragile when written only in silence. So much of what we know about Neanderthals emerges not from their voices, but from their absence. From bones buried beneath loam, from the strange familiarity of tools found in stone shelters, from the curve of a hearth where ancient coals whisper a warmth, now long extinguished. Their world overlaps with ours in both time and geography, and yet remains shrouded in fog, a mist of maybes. Still, within that mist a picture slowly emerges. In regions like southern France, Iberia and the Levant, Neanderthals and modern humans lived side by side, at least for a while. At sites like La Ferricie and El Cidron, evidence suggests not just parallel existence, but complex behaviours, care for the sick, symbolic use of pigment, and possibly even body ornamentation. Some tools traditionally associated with Homo sapiens appear in Neanderthal layers, and vice versa. Blades shaped in ways once thought unique to us now show up in Neanderthal hands. This archaeological overlap challenges the old myth of replacement as a simple, sweeping conquest. Instead, we may be looking at something far more human and far more haunting. Coexistence. Picture it. A narrow valley where two groups hunt the same herds, gather the same routes, track the same weather. Not every encounter would be violent, not every difference marked. Perhaps there were glances across firelight, wary exchanges at the edge of forests. Perhaps children grew curious. Perhaps elders grew weary of fear. And slowly the lines blurred. Shared knowledge, borrowed tools, interwoven songs, and sometimes shared blood. The genetic record confirms that some interbreeding occurred, but not often. It was rare, occasional, which tells us that the relationship was not one of easy blending. There were boundaries, cultural, linguistic, maybe even emotional, that made true integration slow and complex. And in that space, in that cautious meeting of worlds, something unique happened. Not conquest, not war, but a quiet replacement. Neanderthals didn't vanish in a blaze. They faded. Birth rates dropped. Territories shrank. Over time, their numbers dwindled while ours rose. Perhaps our social networks allowed for greater resource sharing. Perhaps our more varied diets gave us resilience in lean years. Or perhaps, in the end, we simply outlasted them. By inches, by decades, by the slow and steady rhythm of survival. And so the shadow they cast grew longer, even as the bodies that cast it disappeared. We often picture extinction as a dramatic moment, like a comet or a battle or a plague. But this was something else, a kind of forgetting, a soft silence slowly deepening. Until one day, no more hearths were lit in their shelters, no more footprints pressed into the wet earth of their hunting grounds, no more voices spoke in the cadence of a vanished tongue, and yet they remain, just beneath the surface. Not in the literal sense, not in tents or tools, but in the woven fabric of who we are. In cheekbones and immune systems, in the way our bodies respond to altitude or cold, in the silent inheritance that trails through chromosomes like threads of ancient wind. They are not gone, not entirely. The line between us and them was never clean, and perhaps it never needed to be. When we speak of Neanderthals today, we speak with both science and sentiment. We examine their genomes, map their migrations, catalogue their artifacts, but beneath the data runs a deeper current, a low hum of something mournful, something tender. Because we do not just study them as another hominin, we feel them, as relatives, as fellow wanderers, as versions of ourselves that might have been. This is not mere romanticism, it is recognition. In their craftsmanship we see care, in their burials, intention, in their endurance, dignity, and in their disappearance, a question that haunts: why them and not us? It's a question that transcends archaeology. It touches the soft underside of our self-understanding, because to acknowledge their loss is to confront the randomness of survival and the costs it carries. Our existence was not inevitable. It came at the quiet expense of others who were thinking, feeling, fearing, hoping. And those hopes were not so different from our own. They too must have told stories around fire. They too, Borek, must have held the hands of their dying. They must have watched children sleep and imagined what the next winter would bring. They must have dreamed, perhaps not in words we would recognise, but in shapes and rhythms that stirred the same ancient chords in the brain. Their minds were not our minds, but they were close enough to make their vanishing feel like a thinning of the human world, a narrowing of possibility, a door gently closing on a room we barely glimpsed. And yet the traces they left behind still speak, if you listen. The ivory talon found in a cave in Croatia, carefully strung like a pendant. The red ochre smeared on bones at La Chapelle aux Saints. The scraping marks of hide preparation left on flint tools handled with practiced grace. These are not just remains, they are residues of presence. Echoes of hands once moving with purpose. Echoes of minds once imagining futures. In this light, the Neanderthal becomes more than a vanished species. They become an absence we carry, a shadow that lives in the shape of our questions. What were they like? Did they love as we love? Did they fear the same darkness? We will never fully know. But we are not meant to know everything. Some things are meant to be felt, and in the case of the Neanderthals, perhaps feeling is the truest form of remembrance. For so long, we told their story in caricature, in thick brows and grunted sounds, in the clumsy shadow of our own supposed brilliance. They were our dark reflection, our evolutionary cautionary tale. But slowly, with each careful excavation and each new strand of DNA unravelled, a more intricate portrait emerged. Not one of simplicity, but of subtlety. The Neanderthals were not failures. They were survivors. They endured over 300,000 years of shifting climates, predators, and hardship, far longer than modern humans have yet existed. They adapted, innovated, travelled. And though we now know they eventually faded from the map, the span of their endurance speaks volumes. These were people, yes, people, who knew the land intimately, who shaped it and were shaped by it, who knew its rhythms not as theory but as instinct. There is evidence still being debated that they may have cared for the injured and elderly, that they may have marked their dead with ochre or laid them gently in the earth. If so, then even their grief was ancient, one of the first to recognise death not as a disappearance, but as a presence that lingers. That understanding speaks of a mind not only capable of survival, but of meaning, and what a delicate thing meaning is. When we contemplate the end of Neanderthals, it's easy to focus on the mechanics. Population bottlenecks, environmental pressures, competition for resources. But beneath those lies something quieter, more elusive. The emotional cost of being the ones who remained. Because extinction, especially of a kindred kind, is not only a biological event, it's a philosophical one. Their silence echoes into our own. It makes us ask what it means to endure. Not just to live, but to outlive. What it does to a species to look behind and find fewer familiar faces, fewer echoes in the landscape. To know that someone who once walked beside you no longer does, that their stories have ended, that yours have not. This is the sorrow of survival. It is the burden of having memory where others do not, of carrying not only your own lineage forward, but the fading outlines of another. It is the knowledge that you were not alone once, and now you are. And in the flickering torchlight of those Upper Paleolithic nights, when the wind turned cold and the mammoths moved far beyond the horizon, perhaps our ancestors felt that sorrow too. Perhaps they looked at the empty shelters, at the quiet valleys, and wondered where the others had gone, not as rivals, but as kin, and perhaps, just perhaps, they told stories to keep them close. Stories passed from one voice to another, from fire to fire like fading embers carried in cupped hands, tales not written but remembered, shadows that moved with meaning, a shape on the horizon, a whisper in the forest, a dream that wore the face of someone no longer seen. Because in a world where the stars returned night after night, but people did not, it must have meant something, this loss. Even if they didn't have the words for extinction, they had the feeling, they had absence, and they had memory. Perhaps that's why some of the earliest cave art seems so haunted, not just by animals, but by presence, the presence of watchers, of others. Red ochre hands reach out from the past, fingers splayed like questions, and maybe some of those hands were Neanderthal hands, or maybe they were the hands of Sapiens who remembered them. The truth is, we don't know where the story ends because it doesn't. It continues in us. Every time we ask what became of them, we're asking something about ourselves, about the fragility of identity, about what makes a person more than flesh, what makes them memory, meaning, myth. The Neanderthals are part of that myth now, not as fantasy, but as something older, as grief remembered in bone and breath. Today, the landscape they once walked is silent, but not still. Winds still sweep the valleys, rivers still carve their ancient beds, and sometimes a fragment of skull or tool is unearthed, something small, something forgotten, and just like that they return for a moment, present again, seen again, and maybe that's all remembrance really is. The ability to say, they were here, they mattered. Their world, though vanished, shaped our own. We carry it in small ways, in blood, in thought, in story. So when you next feel alone under a winter sky, think of them. The others who once looked up at those same stars, their breath curling into the cold. They didn't vanish in battle. They didn't fall with a cry. They faded like moonlight on snow. But traces of their warmth still linger. And maybe survival is not about being the last. Maybe it's about remembering those who were. Hunger is not a sensation. It is a season. It settles in with the snow and deepens with the wind until it becomes a second skin, a quiet companion in the frozen dark. In the Upper Paleolithic, winter did not arrive with calendars. It arrived with absence, fewer tracks in the mud, a thinner sky, the silence of rivers sealed in ice. And in that silence, humanity learned the shape of waiting. To live then was to move. Stillness was death. The Mammoth steppe, vast and golden in summer, became a gauntlet in the cold months. Herds vanished southward. Grass withered. The snow, once gentle, became a barricade between stomach and sustenance. And so people followed the pulse of the land, not aimlessly, but rhythmically, like breath. Seasonal migration was not a strategy. It was memory, bone deep and passed down like myth. Imagine a trail winding through the cold, bare feet softened by fur, shoulders draped in stitched hide, eyes scanning the ridges for the sign of movement. These were not wanderers. They were witnesses to the earth's heartbeat. They knew when to move. They knew when to rest. And always, always, they knew the cost of being wrong. What must it have felt like to leave the safety of a known cave, carrying only what your arms and mind could bear? To trust that the reindeer would return, that the rivers would thaw, that spring, like a promise, would not break. In those moments, the world shrank to what could be carried: flint, fire, kin, and memory. Each band had its own rhythm. Some moved in vast loops across the steppe, following mammoth paths etched into the land over generations. Others stayed close to the edges of the forest, where roots might be found even in frost. but all shared one knowledge, that the world did not wait for those who stood still. And in this motion, identity formed. Territory was not lines on a map, but a song sung by footsteps, a path worn by trust. The routes between caves and kill sites, between winter shelter and summer bounty, were sacred. Invisible to us now, they were once braided into the land like threads of belonging. You could walk and remember your ancestors. You could walk and become them. But movement alone was not enough. Timing was everything. Move too soon, and you waste your strength chasing shadows. Move too late, and the herds are gone, the cold too deep, the water sealed away. So they watched. They learned the language of sky and tree, of wind and scat. They read the world like scripture, and what they read told them when to move. This is the wisdom of the long winter, not just how to survive, but when to risk, when to gather your people, when to leave the warmth of flame for the unknown chill of the trail, when to hope, and what happens when hope runs thin. Then you wait. Inside the shelter, whether it is a limestone cave tucked into the hillside, or a structure of mammoth bone and hide lashed together in the wind, you wait. The world narrows to the firelight. Time softens into a rhythm of breathing and tending and conserving, each movement deliberate, each gesture honed. The outside may rage with snow and silence, but inside life is still moving, gently, slowly, like an ember buried in ash. Camp life during the long winter was not idleness, it was vigilance. Days were short, nights were endless, and between them passed a series of careful rituals, scraping hides, carving points, boiling marrow, repairing the lines of thread twisted from sinew. Children watched, the old instructed. The hunters returned with less, sometimes nothing, but still the fire burned. Inside roles emerged, not rigid, but respected. Those with strength prepared for what would come. Those with knowledge remembered what had been, and in between them sat the quiet labourers, weaving the fabric of survival with hands and patience. A woman threading bone needles by firelight, a child learning to tie the knots that hold a shelter down. These were not acts of survival, they were acts of culture, invisible but essential. The hearth was not just for warmth, it was the centre of the world. Around it, people shared dried meat and softened stories. They taught through rhythm, through repetition, through gesture and tone, and always the unspoken agreement, what we know must last longer than we do. Memory was preserved not just in minds, but in habits, in the way meat was cut, in how ochre was mixed, in where tools were left and why. Scarcity did not only shape the body, it shaped the mind. When little is left, everything matters more. A broken flint blade is not discarded, it is reshaped, handed to a child to practice. A failed trap becomes a lesson, a lost hunt becomes a prayer. In this way, the long winter was not just endured, it was transformed into a season of attention, of mindfulness honed by hunger. The winter did not erase the world, it reduced it to its core, and at the core was each other. There is no record of who laughed first in the cold, or who soothed a crying infant with a carved bone rattle. But we can imagine them because we still do these things. We still seek one another in the dark. We still tell stories to stretch time. We still work with our hands when our hearts are heavy. The Upper Paleolithic camp was not so different from the rooms we gather in now. It was filled with presence, and presence more than anything was the antidote to fear. Because fear was real. The food might run out, the river might not thaw, the herd might not come back, but even in that fear, they stayed, together. And in staying, they made generosity into a practice as deliberate as any hunt. Scarcity taught them not to hoard, but to ritualize sharing, turning survival into a social art, a law written in exchange and memory rather than carved on stone. Imagine a night when the hunters return with little more than frost on their beards, and yet a child unwraps a scrap of preserved fat and passes it to an elder, whose hands tremble with cold, and that small passing is not charity but covenant, a visible promise that tonight, and perhaps tomorrow, we will hold each other. How do you organize such promises without paper or court? You do it with repetition. You do it with rules made of habit and voice. You do it by teaching children which spoils are to be shared first, by who eats when the meat is too little, by where the last marrow bone is broken, and to whom its marrow is given. Scarcity sculpts compassion into technique. The tied bundle left at a neighbour's entrance, the portion reserved for the sick, the string of beads passed from mother to daughter as a signal that this family will be cared for in turn. These are not theological prescriptions. They are adaptive behaviours encoded into the muscle and the tongue, learned by watching and by being watched. And ritual, in that cold world, was the mechanism by which generosity became dependable. A blessing said before the first bite might be no more than an utterance, but repeated year after year, it becomes a contract. The act of sharing is accompanied by gestures, smearing fat onto a child's lips, marking a spear with ochre before it is handed to another, leaving a carved bone at a crossroads as an offering, and these gestures turn ephemeral kindness into predictable practice. They create expectation, which in turn reduces the anxiety of need. If everyone knows the song that demands sharing, then hoarding becomes not only dangerous but shameful. What at first glance looks like superstition reveals itself as social design, a web of small acts that stabilizes a community across winters. But rituals also serve another purpose. They are the compass by which return is made possible. Hunters leave the hearth in the deep dark of pre-dawn to follow tracks only half seen, and they carry with them tokens, knots in sinew, carved talismans, a pinch of ochre tucked into a pouch, that will mark them when they return, that will announce them to the watchers who wait. These tokens are both mnemonic and protective. They stitch the absent back into the social body. When a hunter comes back with fresh meat, he places the prey at the centre of the camp in a precise sequence. First the bones to the elders, then the sinew to the seamstress, then the fat to the infants, and finally the meat to the body that led the hunt. This ordered sharing is a ritual of reintegration, turning solitary risk into communal benefit. It is a choreography that ensures that those who take the greatest risk receive the honour of sustaining the many, and that no one dies by accident of social neglect. What is generosity but a technology of survival? And what are rituals but protocols that enforce that technology? In the long winter, both were necessary. They allowed people to wait without falling apart, to hope without becoming naive, to act with courage without abandoning prudence. Above all, they transformed scarcity from a private terror into a shared condition, one that could be borne because it was carried together. And so the long winter was also a season of social invention, an era when the human community learned to temper instinct with institution and to bind risk to responsibility, so that the embers of one night could become the fire of many. Still, even invention could not erase the cold. It had to be lived through. It had to be carried in the body like a second soul. And in that long carrying, the world of the Upper Paleolithic took on its own texture of time, a texture not marked by clocks, but by the subtle weight of waiting. The sound of dripping ice in a cave, the thinning curve of the moon, the creak of old sinew binding a shelter's frame. Time passed, not in minutes, but in acts of patience. The world became slow, not stagnant, but deliberate. A bead carved from me ivory might take days. A pattern stitched into hide required quiet, focused labour. These were not luxuries of idleness. They were necessities of slowness. In the absence of plenty, attention became currency. Scarcity demanded presence. You could not rush the making of a good tool. You could not waste meat by cutting it poorly. You could not risk hunting too early or staying too long. Every decision, every gesture, was a small negotiation with the ice. And in that negotiation, rituals became more than social rules. They became maps of meaning. A circle of stones laid at the mouth of a shelter wasn't just for windbreak. It marked the edge between danger and refuge. A song sung during food preparation wasn't simply rhythm. It encoded knowledge, remembered sequences, things too important to forget. Ritual allowed people to step into a predictable world even when the landscape itself was unstable. It created a scaffold of meaning across the blur of snow, and perhaps that meaning was not just practical, it was sacred. When you live close to death, life becomes luminous. The breath of your child rising in the cold air is not merely warm, it is holy. The act of lighting a fire again and again becomes a kind of prayer. The old woman who tends the embers is not just a helper, she's a keeper of continuity, the one who knows how to coax flame from memory. In such a world you do not speak of years, you speak of winters survived, and in that measure, The greatest achievement was not the making of tools or the conquering of landscapes. It was the continuity of presence, the ability to say, we remained. Through cold, through hunger, through long silences, we remained. And when spring finally broke the sky apart, when the ice sighed and retreated, it was not merely a return to abundance, it was a return to rhythm, to movement, to the tracks in the thawing mud and the migration trails remembered by both man and beast. But winter would come again, and they knew it. So they marked its passing with gratitude and its promise with preparation. Because the long winter was not an anomaly, it was the rhythm. It was the drumbeat beneath the human journey, and those who learned to live within that rhythm, to shape their lives around its return, became more than survivors. They became memory bearers, pattern holders, the ancestors of a species that would, one day, try to map the stars, build cathedrals, write symphonies, and still instinctively gather around fire when the nights grow long. What we call culture may have begun here, in the repetition of waiting, in the learning not to flee the cold but to listen to it, in the making of songs that counted time when no crops yet marked the seasons, in the stories told not to entertain, but to remind. Rituals made return possible, not only return to place but return to meaning. A group who migrated south for the season would leave behind more than ashes and bones. They might leave markers, stones placed just so, or a carved spiral on a boulder, or ochre smeared on a tree. These were signals to the future self. We were here, and we will be again. A map not of distance, but of intention. A quiet insistence that life continues if we can find our way back. And so each return was more than survival, it was reaffirmation. It told the children, in gesture and action, this is who we are. We are the people who wait. We are the people who return. We are the ones who carry warmth through the dark. By the time spring thawed the rivers and the mammoth trails re-emerged, the people were ready, not just with sharpened spears and mended packs, but with minds tuned to the rhythm of the world. They had become participants in something older than themselves, not masters of nature, but students of its pulse. And what they learned, through hunger and holding on, was that even scarcity could be a teacher, that hardship could be translated into ritual, that generosity shaped by need could become inheritance. This is what the long winter gave us. Not just the technologies of survival, but the ethics of it. It taught us that the most enduring structures are not made of stone or bone, but of kindness, of shared burdens, of gestures that say, I will wait with you, I will remember with you, I will come back. Even now, when we light a fire and gather close, when we cook for someone else, when we pass a story along, we are still walking the edge of that ancient camp. We are still answering winter with warmth. And perhaps that is the most human act of all, to remain together through the cold, to carry light, not in defiance of the dark, but in rhythm with it, to believe, year after year, that spring will come again. The Ice Age did not belong to Europe alone. While we walk the cold stone corridors of Chauvet or Altamira, and wonder at the flickering stories painted in fire and ochre, we must also turn our gaze outward, to the endless steppes, the distant coasts, the forgotten islands, and the hidden paths that braided across the planet, invisible now but once known by heart. Humanity was not a single voice during the Upper Paleolithic. It was a great chorus, each note carried across valleys of snow and deserts of ice, each responding to the same elemental questions in different, ingenious, and hauntingly beautiful ways. What does it mean to survive when the earth itself seems asleep? What shape does life take when each breath fogs in the frozen dusk? Far from the caves of France, on the low wind-carved plains of what is now Ukraine, Siberia, and beyond, another kind of monument rose, not carved from stone, but built from the bones of giants. Circular in form, anchored in mammoth skulls, ribs, and tusks, these shelters tell a story not of flight, but of adaptation. Mammoth bone dwellings, some nearly 30 feet across, were assembled with care and symmetry, their entrances aligned to the wind, their hearths laid precisely at centre. What kind of mind builds with the dead remains of its prey? What kind of wisdom looks at a frozen plain and imagines a house? These structures were not crude survival tents. They were works of spatial memory. A single dwelling might contain hundreds of mammoth bones, carefully selected and interlocked. Around the hearth, lives played out. The flaking of stone, the boiling of fat, the cleaning of sinew. Here, children learned to speak. Here, hands reached out in the dark. Here, in the hush between hunts, the first sense of home may have flickered into being. Archaeologists once thought these bone circles might be ritual sites. So strange and deliberate were their construction. But ashes in the fire pits, flakes of flint, fragments of red ochre, they whisper a quieter truth. These were not temples but dwellings. Their beauty was not in ceremony but in persistence. They held heat. They held story. They held the line against the cold. How many winters passed within their walls? How many mothers waited sewing fur into boots while the steppe swallowed the silhouettes of their sons? How many times was a tusk dragged from a kill, not for its meat, but for its strength, its curve perfect for a roof, its hollow weight just right for a frame? We do not know their names, but we know their gestures. They placed stones around the fire. They saved the largest bones for the windward side. They circled the space like a body curling for warmth. And when the winds howled across the mammoth steppe, they did not run. They stayed. What happens when architecture becomes ancestry? When survival itself becomes memory made visible? When the dead become shelter, and the past becomes a wall that keeps the fire from going out? What if we too once lived in houses made of the bones of what we hunted and loved? And what if, even as others built these domes of memory beneath grey Arctic skies, there were people far away, already moving toward the warmth, across oceans into lands where no footprints had yet been left by human beings? While mammoth hunters shaped bone into shelter, another story was unfolding across a very different horizon, the peopling of Sahul. Sahul was not a single landmass as we know it today, but an ancient continent, one formed during the low sea levels of the Last Glacial Maximum, where Australia, Tasmania and New Guinea were joined in one vast bridge of land floating at the edge of the known world. To reach it, early humans would have had to cross not just territory, but water, deep, black channels between the islands of Southeast Asia, waters that never revealed a dry path, not even at the height of the Ice Age. And yet, they came. The first Australians arrived more than 60,000 years ago, perhaps 70,000 or more. They arrived not once, but again and again, waves of people paddling in dugouts or rafts moving by starlight, following cloud formations and currents, perhaps listening to the cries of birds returning to their roosts across the sea. This was not an accidental migration. It was planned, repeated, remembered. And so a question rises like smoke from a distant fire. What kind of culture knows how to cross a sea without a map? What kind of memory guides you when the horizon is empty and the land you seek cannot be seen? In Sahul, they found a place of fire and flood. Marsupial megafauna roamed the plains. Giant wombats called diprotodons, towering kangaroos, enormous flightless birds like genyornis. The first Australians did not carve their stories into limestone, but into the land itself, etched into the dreaming, a sacred map of myth and geography. In a world without ice, time did not freeze, it flowed, it became song. And in those songs, rivers gained meaning, mountains became ancestors, and walking itself was a sacred act. We do not have stone dwellings from Sahul. We have stones arranged in lines and ochre mines that are tens of thousands of years old. We have ancient fireplaces deep in desert caves, and we have stories, oral traditions passed across hundreds of generations that speak of volcanic eruptions, of land lost to rising seas, of beings who sang the world into shape. These are not metaphors. They are memory, and like mammoth bones on a frozen plain, they are a structure we can enter. Here, the shelter is the mind itself. The navigation is not just across space, but across time. And so we begin to see a pattern, even in difference. Bone circles on the tundra, songlines in the desert, canoes slicing across dark waters, different solutions to the same ancient question. How do we live in a world that doesn't wait for us? This is what unites the people of the Ice Age, not a shared language or belief, but a shared problem. The Earth was changing, sometimes violently, often silently. The cold deepened, the seas shifted, Forests gave way to plains, plains gave way to ice, and in each corner of the world humans answered in their own way, not with mastery, but with attentiveness, not by controlling the world, but by listening to it, closely, repeatedly, across lifetimes. In the Arctic, where wind scoured the skin and snow covered all but the memory of warmth, they learned to shape fire not just as heat, but as architecture. In Sahul, where salt crept up into the dry lands and the sun painted shadows long before noon, they told stories that doubled as maps, songs that braided together myth and topography. In each place, life bent around the elements. Ice, wind, salt, light. And out of that bending came culture, not as decoration, but as survival. Consider this. In eastern Siberia, we find traces of reindeer bone tools carved with repeating motifs, spirals, lines, hatchings. These may be more than ornament. They may be memory systems, mnemonic devices for tracking seasons, migrations, genealogies. In South America, as early as 14,000 years ago, people were weaving baskets so tightly bound they could carry water. In Africa, ochre was being ground and mixed into symbolic paste in caves like Blombos, tens of thousands of years before that. Different timelines, different landscapes. One question: how do we remember enough to survive? The solutions were as varied as the places themselves, but always they were elegant. Always they were tuned to the local rhythm. And that's the great secret of the Upper Paleolithic. It wasn't a single dawn. It was a constellation of awakenings. Not just one place where modern humans emerged, but many places where humans, old, new, hybrid, chose to live deliberately, symbolically, collaboratively. It wasn't Europe's fire alone that lit the dark. There were sparks in every direction. This is why we must be cautious when we tell the story of humanity. It is not a ladder, but a braid. Not a march, but a weaving. The people of the Mammoth Plains, the singers of the dreaming, the foragers of the Congo Basin, the sailors of the Pacific. They all stood at the same threshold, looking out into a world vast and unsure, and each one answered the world in its own tongue. We cannot see all their answers now. Time has taken most of them, but some remain. In the curve of a shell pendant, in the soot-black ceiling of a cave, in the placement of a hearth, in the trail of a canoe, all of it says, we were here. We saw what you see. We felt the cold. We crossed the water. We waited for the spring. And while we waited, we remembered. Because waiting was not empty time. It was opportunity, for story, for craft, for weaving the world into something that made sense. Every Ice Age culture, no matter where it flourished, had to contend not just with hunger and distance, but with time itself. In the long nights and colder dawns, people turned inward, and from that inwardness came some of the most enduring traces of our shared humanity. There is a hearth in a cave in Patagonia, where the ashes were laid down 13,000 years ago. A little to the side, someone left a flute, carved from the wing bone of a condor, pierced with holes worn smooth by the oils of fingers. What song was played? So far from the Mammoth Plains, so far from the ochre mines of Africa, or the bone shelters of Ukraine. It may have been for comfort, or for rhythm, or for joy. But in that breath blown through bone, we find again the universal answer. Art, not as decoration, but as survival. And in Japan, along a coastline now swallowed by sea, some of the oldest known pottery was already being shaped by hands that lived off fish and nut and snowfall. These vessels, coiled and fired, mark a different solution to the same elemental problem. How do we hold warmth? How do we preserve? How do we stay when the land itself shifts? Even in the places we once thought were left behind, we find ingenuity. In Central Africa, during the late Pleistocene, stone tools reflect a logic of design as precise as anything in Europe. In the highlands of New Guinea, early evidence of agriculture begins to whisper in the soil. These were not places waiting to be discovered. They were places already in motion. We are beginning to understand this now, that there was no centre of human advancement in the Ice Age. Only centres, plural, fluid, shaped by weather, by geography, by need, and each one left behind something worth listening to. In their variety, these cultures remind us of something both profound and humbling. There is more than one way to be human. The shape of a shelter, the material of a tool, the voice of a song, the meaning of a death, These things differ, but their roots reach the same questions. How do we live? How do we last? How do we remember? We tell ourselves we are modern, that our complexity is recent, but the evidence, quiet and patient, says otherwise. The people who walked out of Africa, who bent wood and flint to purpose, who carried ochre across deserts, who whispered stories to their children under bone-frame tents, they were not waiting to become us. They already were. And perhaps what we're really chasing in the ruins of these ancient lives is not evidence of progress, but reminders of presence. Not the first signs of civilization, but the first signs of care. A hearth kept burning, a shelter raised with precision, a handprint left in ochre on a stone wall. Each of these is a declaration, not of dominance but of continuity, because while the world fractured, they held fast. While glaciers grew and coastlines vanished, they adapted. Some migrated, some stayed. Some carved memory into stone, others sang it into the land. And in doing so, they gave us a map, not of place, but of response. Look closely and you'll see it. The echoes between worlds, a mammoth bone circle in the windswept plains of Ukraine, built from the remnants of the hunt, and a circle of stones in the Australian desert, guiding feet along invisible songlines. The thick-walled pottery of Jomon, Japan, and the ochre-lined cradles of newborns buried in Ice Age Italy. A flute found in a South American cave and the rhythmic click of castanets made from reindeer phalanges in prehistoric France. Different continents, different climates, and yet something the same. The human urge to make, to remember, to respond with grace to a world that offered no guarantees. This is the quiet truth of the Upper Paleolithic. Its people were not waiting for the Neolithic to arrive, for agriculture or metallurgy or writing to make them whole. They were already fully human, curious, adaptive, emotional, symbolic. They lived in 1,000 ways under the same sky, and that sky, so often clouded with ice or thick with salt wind, is perhaps the only witness still present. So when we ask what it meant to live beyond the ice, we're not just asking about climate or geography. We're asking something deeper. How did humans become many and still remain one? How did difference bloom without division? How did people who never met still answer the same ancient questions over and over with such grace? Perhaps because they didn't see the world as theirs to conquer, but as theirs to hear. And if we listen, quietly, patiently, we might still catch the sound of footsteps in snow, the hush of paddles on water, the rustle of leaves in a shelter made of memory. We might remember that the past is not behind us. It surrounds us, in breath, in silence, in the shape of our own hands. And somewhere, in the distance beyond the edge of ice and firelight, another chapter begins. It began not with a roar, but with a melt. Across the spine of continents, the breath of winter grew shallow. Ice sheets that had once towered like gods, silent and immovable, began to fracture from within. Their bellies softened, their edges bled. And though the air still whispered cold, deep beneath the crusted surface, something ancient stirred. Warmth, pressure, release. What happens when a world built on stillness begins to move? Over thousands of years, measured not in lifetimes but in the slow ticking of eons, the planet began to shift beneath the feet of its inhabitants. Glaciers, once the architecture of the world, receded like vanishing sentinels, and in their wake they left rivers swollen with meltwater, valleys rearranged, shorelines drawn anew with invisible hands. Entire coastlines drowned, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a long, quiet swallowing. Lands that had connected continents, like the great Mammoth Steppe bridge between Siberia and North America, disappeared beneath rising seas. Europe's low plains filled, inch by inch, until forest became marsh, and marsh became sea. Was it grief or awe that gripped the first people who stood at the edge of a world they had once walked, now vanished under waves? These were not mere changes in scenery, they were ruptures in memory. For people who lived through cycles of ice and thaw, the land was not just environment, it was inheritance. When the glaciers melted, they did not only erase terrain, they erased maps drawn in footsteps, migration paths etched in bone, hunting grounds remembered in song. To lose a river was to lose the thread of a story passed down across generations. To watch a familiar mountain hollow into a lake was to feel the bones of the earth shift beneath your own. But nature was not finished. As the ice let go, so too did the sky. Torrents of rain lashed across freshly exposed ground, carving channels into mud, feeding floods that swept through young valleys with no memory of restraint. Storms gathered over the reborn oceans, their clouds heavy with ancient moisture. Lakes breached their barriers in cascading pulses, reshaping the continents with ferocity unmatched even by fire. In North America, the bursting of glacial Lake Agassiz unleashed a torrent that may have surged for months, even years, releasing more water than all the world's rivers combined. It tore through the centre of the continent, carving new basins, draining old ones, and perhaps even shifting the rhythm of global climate for centuries to come. This was not a time of peace, but of upheaval, and those who survived it did not merely witness change, they walked its edge. Entire generations came of age in a world that would not stay still, where the landmarks of youth had vanished by adulthood, and where new landscapes offered both promise and threat. How does a culture root itself when the ground beneath is melting? How do you name a home that refuses to hold its shape? Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they carried home with them, written in story, tattooed into memory, whispered to children beside new fires kindled on ancient stone. But as they moved, something else began to fade. The world that had fed them, the old glacial world of giants, was slipping away. The mammoths that had once thundered across the plains grew thin, then few, then gone. The woolly rhinoceros, the cave lion, the steppe bison, all the creatures that had filled Ice Age dreams with strength and danger, vanished like breath in cold air. In a few thousand years, the great bestiary of the Pleistocene collapsed into silence. It was not a single disaster, not one sharp wound, but a long unthreading. Some perished as the grasses changed, as the tundra's wide-open ranges gave way to forest and bog. Others fell under human hands, too many spears, too much cleverness in too short a span, and still others died of hunger or confusion, cut off from migration routes that no longer existed, trapped between flood and forest. Imagine it, a landscape filled with bones, ivory curling under the weight of time, antlers tangled in the roots of new trees, the echoes of herds replaced by the murmurs of birds and insects reclaiming the air. For the people who lived through this, the world must have felt like it was shrinking. The horizon, once alive with movement, now still. The earth, once crowded with kin and quarry, now sparse, emptied, lonely. The loss was not just ecological, it was spiritual. To live among giants was to live among myths. The mammoth was not merely hunted, it was honoured. Its bones became homes, its tusks became carvings, its image appeared in art across continents. It was a partner in survival, a presence that shaped the rhythm of life. And when it was gone, that rhythm broke. The people who remained had to find new ways to understand the world, a world without giants, without continuity. And yet, the end of one world became the beginning of another. As the great animals vanished, the forests spread. Birch, pine, and willow crept north, replacing tundra with woodland. The air warmed, lakes swelled in the hollows left by melting ice, and within these greened landscapes new creatures appeared. Deer, boar, and aurochs, smaller, faster, harder to catch. Humanity too changed in response. Bows replaced atlatls, traps replaced drives, patience replaced pursuit. But there must have been mourning. In the carvings from this transitional time, antler figurines, ivory beads, small sculptures buried with care, we see not triumph, but tenderness, a sensitivity to loss. It's as if people knew the old world was gone, and that to remember it they would have to make it live in miniature, in art, in story, in song. The great herds became sacred in memory, surviving not in flesh, but in imagination. And so the people adapted, as they always had. They moved through the forests, they followed the rivers that had once been walls of ice. They learned the language of the thaw, the sound of dripping water, the rustle of leaves, the sigh of wind through new grass. But in the back of their minds, perhaps they still felt the absence, the weight of what the world had lost, the silence after the mammoth's call, the emptiness of a steppe without its shadows. And yet life persisted, because that is what it does when the ice lets go. It shifts, it listens, it begins again. And so the world reshaped itself, like a potter moulding new earth from old clay. The glaciers, once heavy enough to press continents down into the mantle, had receded. In their absence, the land rose, slowly, like a held breath released after thousands of years. Coastlines changed, valleys widened, islands emerged where once there had been nothing but ice and silence. But the most profound change was not one of geography. It was one of perspective. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, humans were living in a world that no longer looked like the one their ancestors had known. The rules were new, the paths were new. The world, though older than thought, felt freshly born. And into that unsteady freshness came stories. Because when the ground shifts, people reach for meaning. In these new forests and lakes we find the early traces of myth, not written in books but carried in the body, in the breath, in the quiet ritual of speech passed hand to hand. Imagine a child asking, "Why is that hill shaped like a sleeping beast?" And the elder answering, "Because once, long ago, when the ice ruled the sky, the mountain walked, and when the sun returned, it lay down and became the earth." These stories weren't metaphors, they were maps. They helped people navigate a world in transition. A cave might be the mouth of an ancestor, a river, the vein of an ancient creature, a foggy moor, the breath of something dreaming beneath. New landscapes demanded new explanations. And the people who walked them were not just observers but participants. In what is now Doggerland, the vast stretch of low-lying land that once connected Britain to the continent, people lived among marshes and estuaries, hunted red deer and aurochs, and perhaps watched the sea creep in season by season, tide by tide. By 8000 BCE, the water had risen high enough that the land was gone, submerged beneath the North Sea. Today, fragments of that sunken world, harpoons, hearthstones, human bones, are trawled up by fishing nets. We do not know their names, but we know they built fires, we know they watched the sea rise, and we know somehow they left behind echoes. From the rising waters of Doggerland to the reborn forests of Central Europe, a quiet transformation was underway. People became gardeners of memory. They planted meaning in new soil. In the far north, the reindeer trails that once led to snowbound hunting grounds now wound through birch groves and flowered meadows. In the south, rock shelters once reserved for winter became year-round homes. The very concept of home was shifting, no longer just a camp or a cave, but an idea rooted in place. Some returned to old sacred sites and found them changed. The entrance collapsed. The wall where handprints once marked generations now sealed by stone. So they moved their ceremonies elsewhere, painted on new surfaces, sang into new hollows, and told stories about why the old places had vanished. Not as a loss, but as a transformation. A sign that the world, like them, could change and still be sacred. And that, perhaps, was the deeper transformation. Not the melting of glaciers, not the rising of us oceans, but the quiet resilience of meaning. Because while landscapes shifted and creatures vanished, something in the human spirit remained steady. The need to remember. You can feel it in the way stones were arranged in circles across the emerging green of post-glacial Europe. Not simply shelters or tools, but alignments, placed with care to track the sun, the moon, the stars. These early monuments spoke not to survival, but to significance. They were timekeepers. They were prayers. They were memory made visible. In southern France, where once mammoths had been painted on cave walls, people now carved small figurines and buried them in riverbanks. In the forests of what is now Germany, antlers were shaped into musical pipes, hollow and delicate, like breath preserved in bone. This wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity. A way of saying, the world may be new, but we are still ourselves. And what does it mean to remain yourself when everything familiar dissolves? When the land beneath your feet is no longer the same, when the animals you once followed are no longer there to guide you, you begin to notice different patterns. The path of the sun through an opening in the trees, the bloom of a flower that wasn't here before, the silence where once there was thunder. In this silence, people made new kinds of sound, drums carved from hollow logs, flutes from swan bone, voices echoing across river valleys where once the ice had echoed instead. Every culture, across every continent, shaped its own way of speaking to the changing world. In the east, communities along what is now the Amur River began to craft masks, stylized faces shaped from bark and clay. They were worn in ritual, perhaps to embody spirits of forest and water, or to speak with the dead. These masks emerged not from fear, but from relationship, a desire to stay in conversation with a world that no longer answered in the old ways. In the vast tundras of the north, where Mammoth steppe gave way to willow scrub and reindeer herds, small carved totems appeared. Simple animals, smooth stones etched with marks. Some were placed in graves, others tucked into the earth, offerings, anchors, reminders. These gestures were not just reactions to loss, they were acts of becoming. Because to witness a world change so completely, and to survive it, is to be made different yourself. The people who lived through the end of the Ice Age did not merely endure, they evolved. They reimagined what it meant to be human in a world where the sky no longer pressed so low, where the wind no longer howled like a god. And as they reimagined, they remembered. They remembered fire. They remembered names. They remembered how to listen for the old things, even as new things took their place. They stood in the space between worlds, the one that was and the one becoming, and chose to carry the sacred across the threshold. And in that gesture, a deeper continuity emerged, one that had nothing to do with tools or climate, but with how we endure change without forgetting who we are. Because when the ice let go, it didn't just carve rivers or spill oceans into valleys. It released something else, a new human story shaped not only by memory of the past, but by imagination of what could come next. In many places, we see hints of this shift, symbolic and practical, woven together. The shelters of old, once tight and communal, gave way to larger open-air sites. Hearths multiplied. Food was shared not only in family units, but in gatherings that spanned groups, tribes, language. This is where festivals may have begun, where song no longer just mimicked the wind or hunted beasts, but now told of dreams, of migrations, of the stars above. The constellations we still know today, the Great Bear, the Pleiades, may have been named in this time, not by astronomers, but by wanderers, sitting beneath the changing sky, assigning shape to memory. A herd of stars, a hunter forever chasing, a sister lost to firelight. Stories no longer lived only in caves painted on walls that few would see. They moved outward with the people, told around the hearth, carried on the tongue, etched into stone and song and direction. This was the rise of oral culture, not as something new, but as something now freed from the burden of ice. And yet, some memories remained heavy. The great animals, mammoth, woolly rhino, giant deer, had faded into shadow. Their bones were still there, scattered through the loess, buried beneath the regreening plains, but the living herds were gone. Some vanished quickly, others dwindled slowly into whispers. The people noticed. They mourned. They carved the animals into ivory, into memory. They left offerings at old kill sites as if to apologize, or to honour, or both. We sometimes ask ourselves, why did humans survive when others did not? But perhaps a deeper question is, how did we carry the weight of survival? Because survival is not just endurance, it is remembering. It is noticing what was lost and finding a way to live with that loss. It is speaking aloud what others can no longer say. And so, as the world warmed, and the waters rose, and the herds vanished, humans became something more than they had been. Not stronger, not smarter, but more aware of change, and more capable of turning change into meaning. They named what was gone. They adapted. They dreamed forward. And in doing so, they left us a legacy more enduring than stone, the quiet knowledge that even as the world breaks and remakes itself, we can keep telling the story. The world had begun to soften. Ice, once sovereign and unyielding, was in retreat. Glaciers groaned and wept, flooding the lowlands with memory. Forests, hesitant at first, tiptoed into spaces long forbidden, and amidst this slow thaw, some among us began to do something strange, something new. They began to place stones in circles. They began to carve lines into bone and antler that no animal would ever need to know. They began to arrange time itself, not only in survival, but in story. What were these places, raised not for shelter, not for warmth, but for something quieter, older? At sites like Göbekli Tepe, where the dust of Anatolia cradles the bones of giants, humans shaped limestone pillars with arms and belts and placed them like sentinels in sacred geometry. These were not homes. They were not storage. They were not the byproduct of a simple life. They were destinations, pilgrimages, vortices of meaning. What compels a people to build with such precision only to bury it again? Even before Göbekli there were hints, in the valleys of Brittany, in the stone alignments at Karnak, and in the quiet corners of what is now Ukraine. Mammoth bones were aligned in circles, antlers stacked in patterns that echo intention. There, the geometry of presence had begun. The earth itself became canvas. Meaning was no longer transient, scratched in ochre on a cave wall or woven in song. It was now anchored. It could not be carried in the hand, but it could be returned to, again and again. What does it mean to build something not for this moment, but for a moment that might never come? These were not just structures. They were time held still. Monuments to something deeply felt, if not always understood. In their construction, we find no kings, no rulers, no empires, only an alignment of hands and will. Why then? Did these early humans begin to carve permanence into a world that was still shifting, still unsure? Some say these circles were calendars, that their stones mapped stars or seasons, celestial choreography that governed migration or planting. Others speak of initiation spaces, echo chambers for chants that stitched the living to the dead. Still others believe these were graves in disguise, not for bodies, but for stories, mythologies buried not beneath soil but inside repetition. The true function may always elude us, but the intention is undeniable. Something was being remembered. Something was being offered. And then there is the silence between the stones, the negative space, the shadows cast at dawn and dusk. In that emptiness something breathes, something lingers. The quiet is not absence, but invitation. What does it mean when memory outlives its makers, when the stones remember what the voices have long forgotten? These were the first seeds of monumentality, not out of conquest, but out of reverence. A reverence for time, for ancestors, for something beyond survival. And so the question forms like mist rising from a warming earth. What happens when memory leaves the mind and takes a root in stone? Perhaps that is when myth begins, because in the spaces between those pillars and circles the living started to speak to the dead. Not in despair, but in recognition. Death, once a private loss, began to acquire geography. It was no longer something that vanished into forest or sky, but something that could be visited, revisited. The dead became a presence, not a disappearance. You can almost feel it in the arrangement of stones at Dolní Věstonice, in the Czech hills, where a woman was buried beneath mammoth ivory and ochre. Her body was placed with tenderness, the pigments bright as fire. Nearby lay a kiln, hardened by heat, where clay figures had been shaped and shattered. The air there still hums with intention, the quiet overlap of death and creation. This was not survival. This was meaning made visible. In other sites, red ochre stained bones by design, as if to recall the colour of blood, or sunrise, or life itself. Some skulls were removed, painted, reburied, rituals of continuity that may have echoed across generations. The living did not forget. They built memory into the landscape, they carved identity into the ground, and out of that carving came story. When people began to live long enough in one place to see their own past take physical form, myth emerged as the bridge between what was and what would be. A burial mound was not only a grave, it was an ancestor's dwelling, a mountain in miniature, a link to the first beings who shaped the world. Each mound, each circle, each cairn whispered, "You are not the beginning, you are a continuation." And in the flickering light of new fires, as words became ritual, these continuations evolved into mythologies. The hunter who became a star, the mother whose breath stirred the wind, the first animal who offered its life to humans in a covenant older than speech. These weren't stories for entertainment. They were architecture, structures built to contain the vastness of change. In myth, the world could be explained, ordered, remembered. The sun returned because it was reborn. The river flooded because an ancestor wept. The The forest grew because a god slept beneath its roots. As ice receded and people began to stay, building camps, then villages, then settlements, memory needed new shapes to hold it. Oral tradition alone was no longer enough. The old songs began to anchor themselves in place, and those places in turn became sacred. Every stone, every alignment, every carving was a node in a network of remembrance. The earliest temples, if we dare to call them that, were not for gods above, but for ancestors beneath. The earth itself became a shrine. And as humans began to raise these circles and mounds, they began to glimpse something profound. Time could be built. A structure could last longer than the body. A shape could outlive its maker. And when that realization took hold, humanity changed forever. Because now, the earth itself could remember. And it began to do so with startling precision. Across what is now Britain, France, Turkey and beyond, standing stones were raised, not scattered, not random, but aligned. Aligned with the rising sun on the solstice, aligned with the setting moon in winter, aligned with the shadows cast by time itself. These weren't mere markers, they were instruments. Time had become visible. At Upper Paleolithic in the Nubian desert, before the pyramids, before cities, people arranged stones in circles that tracked the movements of stars. Among shifting sands and ephemeral rains, nomads paused to chart something eternal. In the middle of a continent still reshaping itself, they grounded the heavens in stone. This was no accident. Some of these structures predate agriculture. They emerged not out of surplus, but out of need. The need to know when the rains might come, when the herds might move, when the heat might return. The seasons mattered more than ever, and so the sky became a book, and stone became its binding. But to think of these places as only calendars would be to flatten their mystery. The alignments weren't just technical, they were sacred. The act of watching the sky became a form of listening, of remembering, of connecting the cycle of stars with the cycle of blood, breath and burial. Stone circles weren't just observatories, they were theatres of return. At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb was constructed so that once each year, at winter solstice, the rising sun would pour through a narrow corridor and light the central chamber. For all other days that chamber lay in darkness, silent, sealed, sacred. But on that one day, light returned. The dead were touched by sun. What kind of mind envisioned such a thing? It is a mind not just shaped by survival, but by rhythm. A mind that has begun to see life not as a straight line, but as a loop. The returning sun is not just heat, it is hope. The lighting of a tomb is not just beauty, it is belief. These structures required cooperation, planning, memory shared between generations. Knowledge handed down not on paper, but in gesture and position, in shadow and chant. Communities gathered not only to build, but to remember why the building mattered. And so, in these places, architecture became ceremony. The stone was not silent. It hummed with repetition, with footsteps and songs, with the murmur of names long gone. To be in the presence of these monuments was not to visit the past, it was to feel the presence of eternity pressing in, slowly, like lichen on stone. And within these places people must have felt something we still chase, that to make meaning permanent, it must be felt not only in the mind but underfoot. That memory, to endure, must become landscape, and in becoming landscape, it became us. For what we call culture may have begun not with words or tools, but with the simple act of returning to the same place, again, and again, and again. Return is the beginning of identity. Imagine the first generations who walked to a familiar hill, one marked by stones, or bones, or the quiet burial of someone remembered. Perhaps they came once a season, bringing food, song, or silence. Over time, a rhythm formed. Children followed parents. Elders taught the sky by pointing. The place grew heavier, not with stone, but with meaning. And then, slowly, memory became ceremony. At sites like Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Anatolia, long before villages or fields, people gathered to raise immense carved pillars in concentric circles. Some weighed multiple tons, depicting animals, snakes, vultures, foxes, with haunting clarity. No one lived there, no one farmed there, and yet they built together again and again. These weren't structures of shelter, they were structures of story. And in returning to these places, people became a people. Shared memory gave rise to shared myth. The circle became not just a place, but a time, a moment repeated, a choreography between the living and the dead, the present and the eternal. This choreography mattered, because by gathering, memory was refreshed. By performing, belief was renewed. By building, identity was reinforced. These places weren't museums, they were mirrors, and they changed how people thought of themselves, not just as individuals or families, but as a lineage, a continuity, a we who returned, who remembered, who belonged. Even the labour of building was a kind of ritual. Stones had to be moved, shaped, aligned. Trees had to be felled, fires lit, tools made. The process was as sacred as the product. The act of doing it together was part of the story. Through this, memory moved from the mind to the body, from idea to action, from fleeting thought to anchored tradition. You can hear it in the footfalls worn into stone thresholds. You can sense it in the smoothed grooves where hands once traced carvings. These weren't abandoned places. They were destinations, anchors of orientation in a world still changing. And through them, people began to mark not just time, but territory. To return was also to claim, to say, we remember this. We were here. The circle, the mound, the pillar, these became coordinates in a map of meaning. They told others and ourselves where we had been and who we were becoming. They were not only acts of devotion, they were declarations of presence, because in the end, to remember is also to resist disappearance, and stone remembers longer than flesh. It doesn't weep, it doesn't speak, and yet it holds. It holds the shadow of a touch, the rhythm of a footfall, the silence of a name no longer spoken. This is what the builders must have understood, that one day they would be gone, that voices fade, that bones return to soil. But that perhaps, if shaped just right, a stone might remain. The longing to endure is not a modern feeling. It echoed in those who lifted mammoth tusks into domes against the cold. It flickered in the torchlight that painted reindeer in ochre across the walls of caves. And it pulsed in those who carved, placed and aligned stones not for shelter, but for remembrance. These acts were not practical. They were human. We still don't know what many of these monuments meant. We may never know. But in a way, the not knowing is part of their power. Mystery is not the absence of meaning. It is its expansion. It asks us to listen more carefully, to look again, to feel. Because meaning, like memory, is not always spoken. Sometimes it is built into the windbreak of a bone shelter, or the axis of a solstice sunrise, or the careful spacing of stones set in a wide and empty field. Sometimes it is the pause itself, a circle in which people gathered not to work, not to eat, but to remember, to be part of something larger than themselves, a rhythm that stretched before birth and beyond death. And so memory became not just what we kept in the mind, but what we left behind. Stone was not the beginning of architecture, it was the beginning of echo, the beginning of something that could say, we were here, we saw the stars turn, we named this hill, we loved and we feared and we sang. It is easy to mistake these places for silence, but that is only because we are listening with the wrong ears. They are not ruins, they are listening posts, they are time made patient, and in walking among them we are not looking back. We are stepping into the same circle, we are becoming the echo, because the stones still remember, and they are waiting for someone to ask, not what they were, but why we still return. They do not speak in voices, these ancient dead, but they remember. Beneath tundra moss, in layers of ice untouched by sun for millennia, a record lies preserved not in ink, but in the fragile chains of DNA, the silent scatterings of pollen, the chemistry of long frozen breath. As the ice retreats, it does not merely disappear, it exhales, and with that breath, the past begins to stir. This is not legend. It is not the passed down whisper of a tale half remembered around a fire. This is something colder, quieter, and somehow more intimate. The Ice Archive does not sing, it listens. It listens to the centuries, to extinction and rebirth, to migrations across the Mammoth steppe and the lull of ancient seas. Its memory is absolute, dispassionate, and almost unbearably precise. What happens when we learn to read it? In a single teaspoon of permafrost lies a molecular fingerprint of vanished lives. Ancient DNA, sliced from bones, scraped from soil, and teased from the inner marrow of time, has become the historian's whisper. From these fragments, entire vanished lineages emerge. Woolly mammoths, whose tusks curled like frozen rivers. Cave bears, their hibernation eternal. Even humans, wandering through ages we once thought unknowable, now rise again, not in body, but in information. What does it mean to bring the dead to mind, not in myth, but in molecule? From Greenland's glacial sheets to the steppes of Siberia, cores have been pulled like scrolls from the earth. Each ring of trapped air, each grain of wind-blown dust, becomes a sentence in a long, icy memoir. The levels of carbon, the shifts in oxygen isotopes, the dances of microscopic pollen, together they describe the breath and heartbeat of worlds long collapsed. Glaciers may be retreating, but their stories advance. Even the absence of things becomes its own kind of presence. A missing layer of pollen here, a vanished strand of fur-bearing DNA there. Each gap a grave, each silence a tombstone for ecosystems we no longer know how to imagine. Through these absences, extinction becomes legible. Not mythic, not moral, just quiet, unrelenting change. And then, there is the question of survival, not only of species but of knowledge itself. If we, the watchers of this icebound record, vanish tomorrow, will anything of what we understood be preserved as perfectly as these mammoth hairs, these reindeer hoof prints, this pollen drifting through time? How do you archive a feeling? How do you freeze longing? How do you measure the temperature of awe? Perhaps you begin with dust, not the kind that settles on shelves, but the ancient wandering kind, the dust that crossed continents, carried by ice age winds, settling in the stillness of lakes and the glassy bellies of glaciers, each particle a messenger, each grain a timestamp. In Greenland's ice cores, in the valved layers of Arctic lakes, these silent witnesses accumulate. Volcanic ash, soot from long-forgotten fires, spores from vanished forests. They fall, they freeze, and they remember. Trapped in each band of ice is a breath from the sky, a record of gases, of heat and cold, of the exhalation of forests and the sighs of burning grasslands. Scientists lower drills into ancient ice sheets and draw up these scrolls of air. From them, we know when the rains came, when the snows deepened, when the earth sighed into glacial sleep, and when it stirred toward warmth again. The past becomes a pulse, a rhythm traced through isotope ratios and elemental ghosts, and deep in these frozen sediments, between layers of ash and ancient spring pollen, we find stories not only of extinction, but of adaptation. Birch trees creeping northward as the cold relaxes its grip. A sudden bloom of grass pollen signalling the return of grazing herds. The reappearance of charred particles, hinting at the first human-set fires on newly thawed land. A forest, a species, a culture, all revealed not by their presence, but by their sedimentary shadow. Pollen is especially poetic in its precision. It drifts invisibly, yet settles forever. It maps forests that no longer exist and meadows long consumed by ice or sea. Through these yellowed grains we read the unwritten history of a landscape in motion. One year might hold willow, alder, pine. The next, an abrupt dominance of grasses. The plants whisper of droughts, of floods, of the slow walk of warming. But beyond the technical readings, beyond the graphs and calibrated dates, there's something else here. Something harder to describe. A sense of encounter, of intimacy across millennia. These samples, sterile in labs and catalogued by number, are nonetheless emotional artifacts, not because they speak directly, but because they give shape to the invisible, memory, change, loss. When a glacier exhales ancient air, it is not just telling us what the world was, it is inviting us to feel what was once possible, and perhaps what still is. Because what we learn from these archives is not just how climates shift, but how people endured. That even in the most extreme cold there was fire. That even as the mammoths fell, something in us rose. A capacity not just to adapt, but to notice, to remember, to record, and to listen as the ice speaks again. We are, after all, latecomers to this archive. Long before labs and isotope scanners, Humans were already listening to the land. Long before carbon dating, there was intuition, memory, myth. The earth cracked open with permafrost and inside were bones, not just material, but meaningful. The stories we now trace in genome and sediment, they once traced in reverence, in caution, in awe. But now, we can trace a finger along the double helix of a mammoth and understand the pulse of a population. DNA, once locked in a marrow and frozen sinew, tells us how these great creatures moved, how they dwindled, how a warming world unravelled the delicate threads of their kind. From a single molar, we can reconstruct the fate of a herd. We can know not just that they vanished, but when and how swiftly. And the story is not theirs alone. We read in ancient genomes the migration of early humans across windswept plains and icy corridors. We find fragments of Neanderthal DNA in ourselves, not as fossils, but as inheritance. The archive is not just frozen in the soil, it is walking inside our cells. To study this past is, in some strange way, to come home to ourselves. In the soil, we also find parasites and pathogens, ancient illnesses that once passed from herd to herd, from hand to mouth. A frozen wolf's intestines preserve the last meals of Ice Age Europe. The fossilized dung of a hunter's dog records not just what was eaten, but what was shared. Even decay becomes data. Even waste becomes wisdom. And when ancient lakes thaw and loosen their silt, we find the remnants of rituals, charcoal flecks from early hearths, fish bones arranged with care, pollen arranged in unlikely combinations. These were not accidents. They were signs of presence, of ceremony, of people asking the same questions we ask today. What was this world? Who lived here? And what remains? The difference is only the tools. Where they had ochre and intuition, we have centrifuges and sequencers. But the impulse is the same, to look into the past, not just for knowledge, but for grounding, for meaning. Because when you uncover an ancient campsite beneath a melting glacier, when you find footprints preserved in a now vanished layer of clay, you're not merely uncovering facts. You're encountering someone, their pause, their path, their breath crystallized in the frost. The ice does not speak in words, but it speaks. And what it tells us is that nothing is ever truly gone. It is only hidden, waiting, remembering, and now being remembered. The task of remembering is no longer carried solely by elders or myths. It is carried now by science, not as a cold discipline, but as a new form of storytelling. These frozen fragments, these slivers of DNA and layers of pollen, they form not a ledger but a kind of poem. A poem with long pauses, repeated motifs, and silence as punctuation. In the thin rings of an ancient tree, we read the slow encroachment of drought. In bubbles trapped inside glacial ice, we hear the voice of Earth itself, whispering its chemical secrets. From lakebed cores in Siberia and Finland, we find not just data, but drama. Volcanic winters, abrupt thaws, brief blooms of warmth that faded as quickly as they came. These are the crescendos and hushes in Earth's long symphony. And into this frozen music we now add our instruments, mass spectrometers, carbon-14, sediment DNA. These tools allow us to see the unseen. A smear of dark clay, once meaningless, becomes a signature of a temporary shelter. A layer of charcoal becomes a season of fire. A slight shift in sediment colour reveals a river's redirection, a migration route, a survival choice. But even the most advanced technology does not flatten the mystery. If anything, it deepens it. For instance, why do we find red ochre scattered deliberately beneath burials, across continents, over tens of thousands of years? Is it ritual, aesthetic, or something we have no word for? In the archive, this is not explained. It is only shown, layered, repeated, insistent. A mark left by hands we will never shake, but whose gestures we recognize. And so too with aligned stones, with pierced shells, with teeth carved not for utility but for expression. These artifacts do not yield coordinates or climate models. They yield emotion, grief, hope, identity. The quiet declarations of people who knew they would be gone but wanted to be remembered anyway. The more we uncover, the more we understand that the Ice Age world was not just cold and survivalist. It was symbolic, expressive, introspective. Its people were not shadows of us. They were us, curious, inventive, vulnerable, capable of enduring extremes while still wondering where the sun went each winter or what the wind might carry home, and so the archive becomes a mirror, not just a window. When we study the way a glacier advanced, or how herds vanished, or how a people adapted, we're not just learning about them, we're learning about the long rhythm of being human, the patterns that repeat, the ways we hold on. What science gives us, in the end, is not just knowledge, it is permission. Permission to mourn what is lost, permission to marvel at what endures, permission to listen to the deep past not as something distant, but as something intimate, held in the breath of glaciers, in the silence of permafrost, in the hush of ancient snow. And within that silence, emotion survives. Not in language we can directly read, but in gesture, in residue, in design. A grave site marked with flowers whose pollen remains in the soil. A tool sharpened not only for efficiency, but with a touch of elegance. A hearth arranged with care, not only for warmth, but for meaning. These are not just remnants of function, they are acts of attention, and in attention there is intention, and in intention there is the ghost of thought. The Ice Archive gives us a new kind of memory, rooted not in myth, but in matter. We do not need to imagine what they felt. We can sometimes see it, etched in their artifacts, measured in their bones, painted in red ochre across time. The past no longer whispers, it pulses, and yet it never shouts. It remains always quieter than we expect, more humble, more human. As the Ice Age world recedes from our immediate reach, it grows paradoxically more familiar, because we now know how to listen, not only to what was built or broken, but to what was buried, to what was preserved in the slow breath of ice. We can trace climate through the chemical signatures of oxygen isotopes. We can map migrations through ancient mitochondrial trails. We can hear, in the quiet data, the shape of a world being made and remade through the seasons. Still, the archive is incomplete. It always will be. Some stories are too soft, too fleeting to fossilize. Some voices were never recorded except in memory passed down through generations now gone. And yet, even the gaps tell us something. The absence becomes presence. The silence becomes contour. In a way, the Ice Archive becomes not just a record of events, but a reflection of what we value enough to search for, what we are willing to preserve, what we fear losing. This is the paradox of the Ice Age. It was a world of endings and beginnings, a time of extinctions, yes, but also of awakenings, language, ritual, art, grief. All began to gather shape during this long, frozen inhale, and now, as we exhale into the present, the archive continues, not in stone, but in us. We are not separate from this deep past. We are the descendants of its memory, its keepers, its interpreters, its continuation. Each discovery folds another layer into our understanding until eventually we realize the Ice Archive does not simply tell us where we came from. It reminds us that we never truly left. At the edge of all that is known, we return, not to a beginning, but to a question. What does it mean to be remembered? Not in stone, not in books, but in the slow drift of culture, in gestures passed through generations, in the quiet ache that stirs when we gaze at firelight or trace our fingers across ancient bark. Beneath our tools and cities, behind our words and songs, there is a thread drawn taut, a whisper of lives we never touched, and yet carry with us. To remember is not merely to know, it is to feel the breath of those who walked before us, to inherit their awe, their wonder, their yearning to leave a trace upon a vast and indifferent world. In that yearning lies something deeper than survival. We have found their footprints sealed in volcanic ash. We have found their beads carved from shell and bone threaded with care. We have found their buried dead, curled beside ochre and antler, arms wrapped around nothing and everything. These are not the artifacts of beasts. These are echoes of dreams. The people we now call ancient were never trying to be ancient. They were simply trying to be seen, to be held in time, to be felt by someone somewhere, far beyond the horizon of their days, and somehow, impossibly, we have become those someones. We, creatures of glass and steel, stand in museums and deserts and glacial valleys, gazing backward, not with detachment, but with strange and fragile tenderness. How did this happen? How did they enter us? Was it in the shape of a handprint left on stone, the curve of a figurine, the rhythm of a drumbeat that no longer sounds, but still echoes in the pulse of our blood? Perhaps memory does not require permanence. Perhaps it flows like water, shaped by each vessel it fills. The stories once told around fire circles now glow from screens. The constellations once named in hunger and hope now blaze across telescope arrays. But the hunger remains, the hope remains, and so does the wondering. What must it have meant to raise one's eyes to a sky they couldn't understand and feel? Not fear, but reverence. How did they learn to see not just stars, but stories? Not just bones, but ancestors? Not just life, but meaning? We speak of these people as if they are gone, but is that true? Or are they stitched into the very fabric of what we call human? Their myths dissolved into ours, their questions folded into the shape of our own. In the sacred silence of a temple or the grief of a funeral, in the hush before a birth or the tremble of first love, we are not alone. We never were. Is that what it means to be remembered? Not to be named, but to be felt. Because when we sit in silence, we do not sit alone. There is a presence that lingers, ancient and patient beneath the skin of our days. A kind of companionship from those who lived before story had grammar, before gods had names, and though their tools have crumbled and their songs have vanished into the wind, something of their rhythm beats within us, a quiet continuity of awe, a lineage not of blood, but of wonder. Across tens of thousands of years, wonder may be the only thing that has not changed. A bison brushed in ochre on a cave wall, a mammoth carved in ivory and tucked into a child's hand. A ring of stones placed where the stars once aligned. These are not acts of utility, they are acts of attention, of reverence. They say, this matters. And though the language of their message has eroded, the message itself remains intact. We were here and we saw beauty. Sometimes that beauty was survival. Sometimes it was sorrow. A mother pressing a final kiss to a child's brow before burial. A hunter leaving food by the grave of his friend. A handprint left behind, not as a declaration, but as a question. Will someone see this? We have. And in seeing it, we've answered the question. They were not forgotten. They were folded into us. Their rituals become our instincts. Their fears echo in our caution. Their joy lives in the way we still gather, still paint, still tell stories around fire, or its modern equivalent. You see, memory doesn't always live in the mind. Sometimes it lives in motion, in repetition, in the feel of a tool shaped just so, or in the pattern of stepping softly across snow. Anthropologists speak of cultural transmission, but there's a poetry in that phrase too, because to transmit is not just to teach, it is to offer, to entrust, and that's what they did. With every bone needle, every flint shard, every burial mound dusted with red ochre, they extended a fragile offering to the future. And somehow, across ice ages and empires, that offering reached us. We rarely think of ourselves as part of a story this long. Our lives feel fast, isolated, marked by flickering screens and fleeting distractions. But to step into deep time is to remember the wider shape. We are not the crescendo, we are a continuation. A single breath in a long and patient exhale. And in that humbling truth, there is comfort. We are not lost, we are carried. The people who napped obsidian blades and sang to the moon may not have called it history, but they knew what we're only beginning to understand again. That meaning does not require permanence, only attention, only care, only the quiet willingness to remember what the world tried to forget. And still, somehow, it remembers us too. Through pollen caught in ancient ice, through footprints pressed into hardened mud, through DNA wounds silently inside a molar buried for 40,000 years. The Earth has become our witness. It has recorded more than we ever intended to say. Not through words, but through presence, through residue, through pattern. It's strange to think that the land itself might be holding our memories, storing fragments of the lives that came before like a kind of subconscious. A memory not of thought, but of form. A riverbed still tracing the flow of vanished glaciers. A hill where wild horses once grazed, remembered only in the shape of the soil and the seeds left behind. And just as the land remembers them, so too do we, sometimes without even knowing it. A lullaby sung to a child in a language no longer spoken, the instinct to circle around firelight, the way we pause, still, when we enter a cave. There is something inside us that recognizes these spaces, some ancestral hush activated by stone and shadow. We often speak of ancestors as if they are behind us, but perhaps they're beneath us, around us, within us, part of the rhythm we live by but no longer name. Their gestures are folded into our gestures. Their stories hum beneath our own, not in the sense that we consciously recall them, but in the way muscle remembers movement, in the way the heart remembers a beat it never learned. Even the stars remember. The constellations we trace tonight are not new. They are the same lights that rose above mammoth hunts and midnight births, the same sky that watched over Neanderthals and early sailors crossing into Sahul. And when we raise our eyes to it, even now, we become part of that same long gaze. It's a connection made not through technology or lineage, but through attention, through wonder. And perhaps that is all that memory really asks of us, to pay attention, to notice what has passed and what remains, not just in bones and artifacts, but in breath, in gesture. In the ache of recognition when we see something old and feel it stir something wordless inside, because in the end, to be remembered is not about monuments, it's not about being named or known, it's about mattering to someone who never met you. It's about the thread of attention that loops across time, binding lives that never touched into a shared quiet, a mutual becoming. So when we kneel at a burial site, or run our hands along a carved mammoth tusk, we are not just studying the past, we are being studied in return, seen, perhaps dimly, across the threshold of time, by the ones who first imagined what it meant to be seen. And if they could speak to us now, maybe they would not explain, or justify, or even instruct. Maybe they would simply say, "You are not alone, you never were." And in that soft assurance, something shifts, not just in how we see them, but in how we see ourselves. The modern world often feels like it exists apart from the past, like a tower built on top of forgotten foundations. But under that concrete and glass, beneath the noise of our present routines, there is still the pulse of something older, something slower, a shared hum that transcends invention. Because while our technologies change, our questions do not. What is love, and why does it ache? What happens when we die? Why does the world feel beautiful and terrible at the same time? These were not born with us. They were inherited. And in that inheritance, we are never as far from those Ice Age minds as we think. They wandered too. And in their wandering, they left us signs. Not solutions, not doctrines, but traces. The curve of ochre across a stone wall. A necklace of perforated shells left with the dead. Lines carved not for maps, but for meaning. Their myths, of course, are lost to us. But the need for myth, that remains. It's what makes us reach for stories when data leaves us cold. It's what makes us long for meaning, even in a world governed by probability. We are not just beings who solve problems. We are beings who make patterns out of chaos, who braid memory into meaning. And what is awe, if not a kind of recognition? A way the body responds when it senses something ancient has returned. A sunset that feels familiar. A stone that hums with more than erosion. A silence in the forest that does not feel empty. Awe is not always loud. Often it is barely a breath, a stillness, a pause, and perhaps that's why our ancestors placed such reverence in quiet spaces. Caves, glades, high ridges under the stars, places where the world narrows to the present moment, and the present moment stretches open, wide as the sky. The Upper Paleolithic world was not simply a time of danger and necessity. It was a world saturated with wonder. They had fewer tools, yes, but also fewer barriers to astonishment. A world where night truly darkened, where stars were not obscured by light, and where every sound in the brush could be spirit or shadow. And in that setting, with no books, no screens, no histories but their own, the only way to remember was to embody, to hold knowledge in gesture, in craft, in firelit song. So when we see them now, etched in ochre, buried with shells, their children cradled in mammoth ivory, we're not just witnessing history. we're meeting another kind of intelligence, one shaped not by speed, but by depth. Not by volume, but by presence. A presence that, if we listen, can still be felt today, humming just beneath the surface of our modern breath. In the end, the greatest revelation of prehistory may not be what we uncover, but what we recover within ourselves. The Ice Age was not merely a chapter in the Earth's climate, but a chapter in human becoming. It was a crucible where myth, memory and meaning were not luxuries, but tools of survival. They built stories the way they built spears, to pierce the unknown. And now, tens of thousands of years later, we still carry those stories in our bones. Perhaps not the details, not the names of their gods, or the shape of their constellations. But the shape of the questions they asked, we know those well. We ask them still. Why are we here? How do we belong? What does it mean to live well, to die well? To be remembered? These are not scientific questions, they are human ones. And long before the first written word, long before cities and kings and borders, these questions lived inside quiet, fireside conversations, deep in caves beneath frozen skies, spoken softly, held closely. And if there is something to learn from these ancient people, these mammoth hunters, these dreamers of red bison and star shapes, it might be this. To live with questions is not to be lost. It is to be alive. They didn't answer everything. They didn't need to. Instead, they made a world where memory lived in gesture, in pigment, in song. A world where the unseen mattered just as much as the visible. Where mystery wasn't feared, it was honoured. And perhaps, as we leave this journey, that is what we carry with us most. The invitation to feel small and infinite at once, to let wonder be enough, to remember not only who they were, but what they trusted we could become. Because in the very act of remembering them, of walking these lost paths, of imagining their fires and their footsteps, we bring them forward. We build a kind of bridge across the millennia, a whisper of kinship that time cannot erase. So now, as you return to your own quiet evening, your home, your warmth, your modern light, know this. You are not the first to feel wonder under stars. You are not the first to grieve, to laugh, to sing to the sky, and you will not be the last. Because the story continues, in every breath, in every question, in every quiet act of memory. The Ice Age may be gone, but we remember, and because we remember, they are not lost. They are carried, still. Thank you, fellow Sapien, for walking this long road through the ice, tracing forgotten footprints and ember-lit myths, and holding space for a silence older than time. If this story stirred something quiet in you, a sense of wonder, a moment of stillness, or perhaps just a new question waiting to be asked, thank you for lending your presence to it. I wonder what lingered for you in this long memory. Was it a single image? A soundless cave? A shadow that felt like home? Whether it was the mammoth bones shaped into shelter, the red ochre brushed across a stone hand, or the last breath of a world drowned beneath meltwater, these echoes belong to all of us now. If something stayed with you, I invite you to leave it in the comments, not as a shout, but as a quiet offering. These small reflections are what shape our strange little community puzzling through time together. If you'd like to follow more journeys like this, ones that reach back, ask softly and look long, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting, in stone, in silence, in starlight. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful,